Kiss. Frog Prince Retold. A Tale in the Romance, a Medieval Fairytale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. If Philemon never felt the scorching desert sands beneath his feet again, he would be a happy man. How much further? He demanded. The camel driver turned and bowed apologetically. At least half the night, Your Highness. If you had not decreed a slower pace, we would be there already. Perhaps, but I would have left my blackened balls somewhere in the desert, for they would have bounced off at the pace this beast was going before. Philemon heard sniggering from behind him, but it was hard to discern one man from another, silhouetted against the setting sun and all. Ah, let them laugh. He'd served with the guardsmen until his father had died, forcing him to assume the throne. Philemon continued, There's little point taking one of the Sultan's daughters as my bride if I cannot consummate the marriage on our wedding night. If I cannot give the city an heir, you'll find yourself a new prince of Tasnim, I am certain of it. The laughter was louder now, for they all knew as well as he did that he was the last of his father's line, and they'd need to look outside the city walls to find someone of sufficiently royal blood to take his place. Whether they liked Philemon or not, he was still their prince, a man of Tasnim. Which was why he gave the orders, not the camel driver. We must set up camp, rest for the night, and we will reach Tasnim on the morrow, Philemon finished. But there is no water, Your Highness, the camel driver protested. Philemon fought to keep his temper. Did the camel driver think he was blind? I can see that, he said with forced calm. Take us to the nearest oasis, and we will camp there. The camel driver spluttered. But, Your Highness, the nearest oasis was the one we left this morning. The only water for miles is in the wells of Tasnim itself, unless some magical wadi appears before us. Philemon laughed, but not for long. The man's idea of magic had merit. Philemon rubbed his ring, the one symbol of his sovereignty he carried with him everywhere. The jinn appeared, bowing low. What do you wish, master? Make me an oasis here, Philemon commanded. The jinn snorted with laughter. My master jests. The best I can make for you is a puddle, if I drink a good skin of wine and piss on that rock. He tugged at the loincloth he wore, as if he intended to do just that. I need water for my men and the camels to drink. Now, Philemon insisted. The jinn spread his arms wide. I have told you what I can do. Maybe you should have found yourself a different jinn, someone more powerful who can command water instead of stone. Fat lot of good he'd be when it comes to opening the gates of Tasnim, but he might be able to fetch you a drink. A different jinn. And Philemon had such a thing. Fetch the genie of the lamp. The one you found in the oasis outside the city gates, he said. I have a task for him. A servant appeared, bowed, then offered Philemon the dented, tarnished bronze lamp. Philemon rubbed his thumb across what appeared to be a scorch mark on the scored surface. Back and forth, until blue smoke began to stream from the lamp spout. The enormous jinn abased himself on the sand. How may I serve you, master? Make me an oasis right here, big enough to quench the thirst of every man and beast here twice over, and still have enough water for me to bathe, Philemon ordered. He waited for this jinn to say the same words as the servant of the ring. Your wish is my command, master. It shall be done. And for that moment, Philemon knew he was the most powerful man in the desert. 2. Anahita knew the very moment she lost her sense of fear. One moment she was screaming, her broken arm splintering into a million needles of pain to the unholy delight of her new husband, and the next, the whole world went silent. He would beat her to death tonight, whether by accident or design, her dreamy mind told her. She should have been afraid, but death would be an improvement over the endless round of beatings that inevitably ended in rape. Her father had given her to this man in an attempt to bring peace, but Sheikh Fari did not understand the meaning of the word. He attacked her father's people to capture women to replace his dwindling number of wives, and he beat her every time her father's men fought back. The only way to end this was to stop him. The sheikh cupped his hardening manhood and grinned. No. She would not submit to him tonight, or any other night. If she was going to die, she would do so without that final indignity. Anahita dragged herself to her feet. You're a coward, a man whose only courage comes from beating women. I hope when my father's men cut you down, they feed your body to pigs. Female pigs, she said. He shouted for his guards, and 2 enormous men rushed into the tent. Anahita knew them both, men the sheikh had assigned to watch her so that she did not run away. Hold her down so that I can cut out her lying tongue, he ordered, and the men moved toward her. Anahita had one chance. Don't touch my arm. It's broken, she implored, cradling it to her chest. Her husband might be a monster, but these 2 were merely men. The guards looked uncertain. A moment's hesitation was all she needed. She crumpled forward, righting herself just before she fell, feeling the leather hilt of her salvation in her good hand. She might die tonight, but she would not die alone. She lunged. The guard's blade pierced Fari's throat, and Anahita thrust it in deeper before ripping it out. Fari fell to his knees, clutching his gaping throat, but the lifeblood sheeting down his chest told the tale's end for him as he gasped his last. When the light went out of his eyes, he pitched over sideways, his limp dick flopping onto the tent floor. He would violate no houris in the afterlife either, Anahita vowed, putting her borrowed blade to work again. She threw the pieces of hacked-off gristle onto a brazier, while blood leaked sluggishly from his groin. Only then did she turn to face the guards. Without fear, for if she died tonight, she died victorious. She held out the bloodied blade, but it slipped from her hand to land point down in the sand. Powerless. That's what she was now. That's all she had ever been. Do your worst, she said, falling to her knees. But she kept on falling into darkness that rose up to claim her. 3. The final stage of the journey home seemed to take hardly any time at all, or perhaps that was because Philemon spent most of it wondering what he would call his new oasis. After all, it was his, created at his command, so he should have the pleasure of naming it. His first thought was the most obvious name for the place, but calling it Lake Philemon wasn't enduring enough. Philemon was hardly a rare name even for a prince, and he wanted no confusion in anyone's mind that the oasis belonged to the Prince of Tasnim. But to call it Tasnim Oasis implied that it belonged to the whole city instead of its ruler. It was true that the wealth of water it contained would belong to the people of the city who traveled outside the city walls, for it was within his territory, but the lake of the people took away from the magic of making water appear in the desert. Well, the jinn had performed the magic, but no one wanted the place named after a slave. Even if Philemon had known the slave's name, which of course he did not. There were far more important people for him to remember. Including Fadi, his vizier, who was waiting for him in his apartments when Philemon arrived back in Tasnim. Philemon sighed. He would have preferred his concubines to be waiting for him, but they would have to wait. The city came first, before Philemon's desires. I trust the city continued to prosper under your care? Philemon asked, beckoning for a servant to bring refreshments for himself and the vizier. Fadi bowed. I do my best, as always, your highness. The city has endured under your family's rule and enjoyed good fortune for many years as a result. But a strange thing happened this morning. He accepted a cup of wine and sipped from it. Philemon paused to savor the first taste of a particularly fine vintage before he replied, this is Tasnim. Did a cat chase a dog? Did my jeweled garden grow? Or did a bird fly out of a well? Fadi managed a smile, but it did not reach his eyes. I fear it is nothing so small as a bird, your highness. Philemon felt the first twinge of unease in his belly. Then spit it out. Tell me what has befallen my city, so that I may set things to rights. It's the wells, my prince. Yesterday they were fine, but this morning none of the buckets would reach the water. Then they need more rope. I am certain there is plenty in the storerooms. Have someone fetch it, and the wells will soon be set to rights. Perhaps the ladies of Tasnim have bathed more often of late, or this summer has been a thirstier season than most. Philemon forced himself to smile even as a chill crept around his heart. Water was life and the lifeblood of Tasnim. If something happened to their water supply. I already have, your highness. It took a dozen yards of rope, but we struck water again. Fadi swallowed, as if he hesitated to say more. Philemon knew his vizier, for the man had loyally served his father for longer than Philemon could remember. He waited in silence. Finally, Fadi continued, I set my clerks to search the records, looking for reports of this ever happening before. So far, they have found nothing. The waters of Tasnim have never dropped by so much. Ever. I fear magic or some sort of curse. Forgive me, my prince, but have you somehow angered someone powerful in your trip to the capital? Through some small act insignificant to you, aroused the enmity of some sorcerer? Philemon burst out laughing. Fadi, I visited the Sultan for one purpose alone, to secure a wife from among his daughters. His matchmaker assured me that the Sultan finds favor with my proposal, and will send an appropriate girl as soon as I send word we are ready for her. Unless some sorcerer has set his heart on the same girl the Sultan intends to give me, chosen by the Sultan, not me, for surely he knows his daughters best, I cannot imagine what offense I have given anyone. And if I have, why let them come? They may bring an army to Tasnim's gates, and we shall stand, as we always have, undefeated. Fadi returned his smile. Perhaps you are right, my prince. Maybe the earthquake we felt last night is the reason for it. It shook dust from the ceilings and spilled soup from my bowl, but little else. Perhaps the water beneath the city spilled out of its vessel too. That's the spirit. Tasnim will not fall while men like us rule her. Fadi left soon after, and Philemon headed to the garden, where his favorite concubines waited among the jeweled trees. The sound of soft music and feminine laughter lifted his spirits like nothing else. Yet later, when both he and his concubines were sated, he dismissed them back to the harem and lay alone in the darkness with his thoughts. Tasnim would not fall, he swore to himself. He was the prince of this city, and he would defend it to his dying breath. He padded out to where his bags had been brought in, and dug out the dented lamp. When the djinn appeared, Philemon didn't give him time to ask for orders. I command you to fill the wells of Tasnim to where they were before I left the city, he said. The djinn eyed him. You want me to bring the water back? Philemon swore. You stole the water from our wells? Then yes, I do want you to bring it back. Immediately. I hear and obey, the djinn said, and vanished. Satisfied, Philemon headed back to bed and a peaceful night's sleep. It would be the last peace he would know for a long, long time. 4. Just leave her and let's go, a male voice hissed. Pain stabbed through Anahita's arm again, that's what had woken her, and she whimpered, her throat too hoarse to scream. She forced her eyes open, but the hulking shadow bending over her blocked the light. The only thing she could be certain of was that he was the one hurting her. Stop, she croaked, batting at him with her good arm. When I have bandaged this properly, or you will be crippled for the rest of your life, the man said. Anahita blinked and turned her head to get a better look at what he was doing. True to his word, he was bandaging her arm, which was already splintered, so that it would heal straight. Take me home, where it will not matter. Servants will take care of me, she said. The men exchanged a glance. Your home is probably destroyed like ours was, and every other village Fari attacked. Your home is gone. Haida, we have to go. Leave her. She will only slow us down. The second man glanced around nervously. They'll blame us for this. We cannot be here when the body is found. And where will we go? Our home is no more, cousin. If we leave her, she will surely die, for Fari's men are no better than he is. I will not leave her to pay the price for justice for Nasreen. She deserves better. Take me home to the capital. Tell the Sultan about Fari. He must know, Anahita insisted. She grabbed the first man Haida's arm and heaved herself to her feet. Up she went, and down again too, for her legs would not hold her. But she would not give up. She eyed the tent wall and the inch-wide gap between it and the sand. Fari's tent stood at the edge of camp, where fewer people would be disturbed by the screams of his women. For once this would work in her favor. She grabbed the jeweled cup Fari had swilled wine from and used it to shovel sand away from the tent wall. Soon enough, she dug a dent big enough for her to squirm through. If we go this way and keep to the shadows, we can reach the camels without anyone seeing us. Do you know where they keep supplies? We'll need food and water, it's a long journey. Well, you heard the lady, the second man said. He threw himself into the shallow ditch Anahita had created, and after some widening of the pit, managed to leave the tent. Come, cousin. Freedom awaits. Haida eyed Anahita. What do they do to escaped slaves in your city, lady? Is it worse than what the desert people do to murderers? Anahita wet her lips. I do not know, but if you are the Sultan's subjects, then surely he will free you for bringing word of what Fari did to your village. I swear I will do everything I can to see you freed, for you should never have been slaves in the first place. I will take a small chance of life over none at all. You first, lady, and I will follow after, Haida said. Anahita nodded and followed Haida's cousin. She hissed in pain as her broken ribs protested at bearing her weight, but she did not stop. She could not make it back home alone, and these men could help her. When she reached the cool night air, Anahita forced herself to her feet, ignoring the pain and the swirling in her head. If she showed weakness now, they would leave her behind. So she gritted her teeth and headed for the camels. A heavy hand landed on her shoulder, yanking her back. What are you doing? He hissed. Anahita glared at him. If we want to get out of here, we'll need a distraction to hold their attention. Releasing the camels to stampede through the camp should do it. Or a fire, Haida said cheerfully, rubbing his hands together as he rose to his feet. A wisp of smoke curled up from the tunnel they'd crawled through. Fool! Haida's cousin growled. I'll get us some supplies. You get her to the camels. If she's not there when I get back, we go without her. He darted off. Shall we? Haida asked. Anahita nodded and led the way to the camels on the outskirts of the camp. She selected 4 who had been part of her entourage when she arrived, and led them away from the rest. Stay here with him, she told them, pointing at Haida. To him she said, these were my father's. They will carry us home. Then she untied the rest. There is food hidden in the tents with the men, she said. Trample the tents and you will find it, but hurry. Heads lifted, and they stared at her uncertainly for a moment. Food. The men in the camp, the ones who beat you, they are hiding it, she said. Go and get it. A cloud of sand surrounded her as the grunting beasts rose to their full height, then lumbered off toward the camp to wreak havoc. Screams erupted. The screams of men, not women for once. Yes, she whispered, elated. What did you do? Haida demanded. A shriek sliced through the sandstorm. A sound Anahita recognized. Vega. She ran toward her. Come back here, girl. Haida's hand reached for her, but Anahita dodged and ran on. She could not leave Vega here. But in the dark, the eagle's tethers were impossible to untie. "Give me your knife," she said, holding out her hand. "We need to go back to get Assad," Haida said. "I'm not leaving Vega. She is my hunting falcon, and she's coming home with me." Anahita glared at him. "Give me your knife and help me cut the others free. They will help with the distraction." She felt the cold hilt in her hand and closed her fingers around it. The sharp blade sliced through Vega's jesses, and the bird rose into the air with a triumphant shriek. "You may hunt in the morning. For now, stay with me," Anahita told the eagle, who settled obediently on her shoulder. She made quick work of the other birds' restraints too. The other birds eyed Vega warily, not budging from their perches for fear of what the eagle might do to them. "Attack the men. They keep you prisoner. Once you are free you may hunt, and all your prey will belong to you and no one else. I will keep you safe from this eagle," Anahita told the birds. "Fly." The falcons rose, a mismatched flock with one deadly purpose. Vega clicked her beak in frustration, and Anahita reached up to stroke the eagle's feathers. "You will fly free at dawn, I promise. But we must get far from here." She hurried back to the camels, where both men stood, waiting. "What did you do?" Haida asked. "I've never seen animals obey like that." Anahita smiled. "Magic." "You're a witch." Haida's eyes showed white with fear. "What's that bird for?" Assad asked, pointing at the eagle. "Vega is what you would call my familiar. My friend. Her only friend out here." "She'd better not scare the camels," Assad said, climbing onto the lead animal. Anahita chose the smallest camel and struggled to climb onto her back. Between her broken arm and Vega, she was exhausted as she sank into the saddle. "A drink for you, lady, for we will not have time to stop until we reach the next oasis," Haida said, passing her a water skin. Anahita nodded her thanks, uncorked it, and drank. Wine coated her tongue, a welcome wetness as it trickled down her raw throat. Then she tasted the bitterness behind it, and it was too late. She tried to curse, but the words wouldn't come. The opium stole her wits, and darkness engulfed her again. 5. Day after day, the water level dwindled, despite Philemon ordering the djinn to refill the wells every night. One well ran dry, then another, and what had once been whispers became loud enough for even the prince to hear his citizens' concerns. Philemon summoned the djinn door guardian. "What do you know about the other djinn?" he asked him. The djinn shrugged. "He is the slave of a lamp, like I am the servant of your ring of office. He's powerful enough, but I don't trust him. My treason has long since passed into legend, but what is his crime? What did he do to deserve eternal enslavement? What if he is here to serve some other master, who wishes to bring Tasnim low?" "You're right. I don't trust him either. Every night I have ordered him to rectify our water woes, and every morning, they are worse. What does one do when a djinn is not following his master's orders?" Philemon asked. The djinn shook his head. "I have never heard of such a thing. It should not be possible. He must be in service to someone else, who means you and the city ill. Someone whose orders are more powerful than your own. The only permitted reason for refusing an order is because a djinn lacks the power to do what he's asked. Otherwise I would fill the city's wells myself, but you know I cannot. So what do you suggest?" Philemon couldn't believe he was asking the djinn for help, but this djinn was once a vizier as loyal to the city as Fadi. And who knew djinn better than one of them? "You can only fight magic with magic, and you need the help of someone more powerful than the lamp slave. I can let it be known among magical circles that you are looking for the help of a powerful enchantress, and you are willing to pay a high price for it. It was on the tip of Philemon's tongue to ask how high a price, but it didn't matter. The only price too high to pay was the loss of the city, and its water supply. If it cost him all the gold in the treasury, so be it. The city's wealth was in its water. Without it, the city would die. Do it. Find an enchantress powerful enough to save Tasnim from this djinn. While Philemon waited for the door guardian's return, he sent camel trains to the as-yet unnamed oasis, to bring back water for the city. His concubines grumbled at having to surrender their bath to become the household water supply, but Philemon left them no choice. Once a place where water was plentiful, for the first time, Tasnim became like other desert cities, where every drop was precious. Finally, the door guardian returned. "I have brought your enchantress, master," the djinn announced. "Allow me to present Lady Zuleika." She was his height, and she wore her hair uncovered, though it was twisted into a complicated knot on the back of her head, held in place by pins or magic, he wasn't sure. From her proud bearing she could have been a princess, not just a mere lady. The door djinn didn't seem to care about introducing him. Philemon sighed. If he wasn't enslaved to Philemon's ring of office, he would have sent the djinn away long ago. "I am Prince Philemon, a humble prince in need of your help to control a troublesome djinn," Philemon said, bowing deeply. "What sort of man sends a djinn to find an enchantress to solve his djinn problem?" Lady Zuleika asked. "It seems like a particularly sadistic task to set your poor slave." Philemon jerked up from his bow and met her amethyst gaze. He'd mistaken her for one of his own people, but her pale eyes and unnatural height marked her as the child of some northern barbarian from the lands where it snowed in winter. He'd heard tales that the northern women fought as warriors alongside their men, much like the women warriors who had once been garrisoned here, and her manners made him believe it. A pity, for the enchantress was young and pretty. She'd make a lovely wife were her tongue not so waspish. Those purple eyes blazed. "Look at me like that again and I will leave," she snapped. Too late, Philemon realized his lust had leaked out of his usually controlled expression. Or perhaps this witch had read his mind. He had heard tales of powerful enchantresses who could do such things. Philemon cleared his throat, trying to clear his mind of thoughts of this girl's body. This djinn is not the problem. It's the other one. The slave of the lamp. He drained the wells of Tasnim dry and refuses to repair the damage he's done. Lady Zuleika nodded. "Ah, no wonder the price you offer is so high. Gold is nothing compared to water in the desert. A djinn who makes it disappear must be stopped." She waved a hand. "Show me the djinn who caused the trouble." Now? It would take his servants some time to make their way to the treasury in the lower levels of the city, to retrieve the lamp and bring it back. Time he did not want to spend in the enchantress's company, risking offending her again. "Summoning the djinn will take time and you must be tired from your long journey here," Philemon said smoothly. "Allow me to accommodate you in one of the finest guest chambers in the palace. Servants will bring you refreshments, water to wash with, and anything else you need. My other djinn will be your guide in the city, showing you anything you wish to see." She inclined her head. "Thank you. I have heard great things about the generosity of desert hospitality, but this is the first time I have had the opportunity to experience it for myself." "You'll have to wait until the water's back before you can use the bathhouse," the door djinn said. Philemon was struck with the irresistible image of the young enchantress in the harem bathhouse. Desire stirred, and more besides. "I'll be in my chambers," he called after her and the door djinn. It wasn't a lie. He would be, after a detour to the harem to find a willing concubine or two to sate his desire. Because more than anything, Philemon knew he needed her magic more than he needed another girl in his bed. 6. Late the next morning, Philemon emerged from his bedchamber, aching in all the right places. Now he could face the enchantress without being distracted. Your Highness, Lady Zuleika wishes you to meet her in the lower treasury, a servant said. Philemon stared. Before I have broken my fast? The woman is mad. Tell her I shall be with her when I am ready. The servant bowed and hurried away. Philemon took his time over breakfast, knowing he needed to calm his irritation before he faced the enchantress. At least until she had restored their water supply. When he felt he was pleasantly full and he'd regained most of his good mood, he set off for the deepest level of the city. Ah, perfect timing, he heard the enchantress say. She beckoned without looking at him. Philemon, come here and order your djinn to remain in his lamp until his master summons him. Philemon wasn't sure which was the greater insult, her familiarity or the fact that she deigned to give him orders. She made an impatient sound in her throat. It's the last step of the spell. Once you've said the words, the djinn will not be able to trouble you again. Even if he was ordered by your enemy to destroy the city as his new master, your orders will take precedence. Hold the lamp in your hands and issue your orders. Grudgingly, Philemon stepped forward and lifted the lamp in both hands. He cleared his throat. Slave of the lamp, you are ordered to remain within the confines of your lamp until I summon you. He set the lamp down on a chest by the back wall. She wrinkled her nose. Not as precise as I'd like, but it will do. Now Carve told me this is your personal fortune and not the city's wealth? Philemon nodded. Indeed. The city treasury is on a different level. These rooms hold the gifts personally given to the many generations of princes who have ruled this place. So, when you offered half of your personal fortune for an enchantress who can fix your problem here, you meant half of that? It hurt to agree, losing so much gold was a blow to any man, but Philemon forced himself to nod. Half of my fortune for saving the city, yes. Good, because I've enchanted all of it. Your half and mine. Anyone who enters this chamber will be filled with such irresistible desire for the gold they see that does not belong to them, that they will not notice the lamp, nor wish to take it from you. Therefore the djinn will remain under your command and inside the lamp, unable to do any further harm to your city. She glanced around. Perhaps I should ward the door too so that no one can open it. Or just you. Philemon shook his head. The gold here belongs to the crown, to me now but to my successors, should I succeed in siring a son. And princes do not open their own doors. We have servants to do it for us. Here. He rubbed his ring and the door guardian appeared. If you must enchant the door, make it so that only this djinn can open it. He is the slave to my ring of office, which passes to my son in his turn. She shrugged, bit her lip, and waved her hand. A faint hint of lavender dust flew through the air and sparkled on the door for a moment before it faded. There. The djinn will trouble you no more. She turned her amethyst eyes on him. Now I would like to take a small part of my fee with me, but leave the rest here, for this is as safe a place as any. A bag appeared in her hand, sturdy enough to hold a great deal of gold. So fast? Philemon smiled. Now you have returned our water to the city, you have more than earned your fee, Lady Zuleika. Her eyes grew wide. Water? Do I look like a water witch? You hired me to deal with a powerful djinn, not fill your water tanks. Which I have now done, so as soon as you pay me for my services, our business will be concluded. Unless you restore the water supply to our wells, I will give you nothing. Philemon shouted. He grabbed the enchantress's arm and dragged her into the corridor. Then he pointed at the door guardian. Seal the door to the treasury and do not open it unless your master commands you to do so. The round stone door rolled into place behind them. Now fix our water, witch, Philemon said. Lady Zuleika snatched her arm from his grip and returned his glare. One, you have paid me for the services already rendered, then perhaps I will consider taking a second commission. Until then, I will not help you, and nor will any witch, once they've heard what I have to say. I will not pay you a single copper coin until you fix our water supply. And I will do nothing for you until you pay me for what I have already done." The door guardian broke the tense silence. "Master, it is unwise." "Silence!" Philemon roared. "Remove this woman from the city and see that she does not return. Then find me a witch who will do as I ask. Then you sentence your city to a slow death by thirst, because of your treachery. No witch will help you now." Lady Zuleika said. "What are you waiting for? Seize her slave." Philemon snapped. The door guardian's expression was one of wide-eyed panic, but he could not say a word. He wrapped one arm around the enchantress, pressing his hand to her mouth so that she could not draw the blood she needed to cast a spell. Without magic, her strength was no match for the djinns as he carried the struggling girl up to the gate. "Good riddance," Philemon called after them. 7. The sun reminded Anahita of her sister Maram, the way it wanted to worm its way into her good graces, and Anahita was having none of it. Every bit of her hurt, and the sun would only blind her if she opened her eyes anyway. Not to mention the gentle warmth she felt now would turn into a raging blaze that seemed to set the very sand on fire. Yet it was as relentless as Maram when she wanted Anahita awake, for she was one who always got her way. No one could resist her for long. But Anahita would hold out as long as possible, for they had played this game for as long as she could remember. An impatient clacking sound got the better of her. Vega did not click her beak lightly. Finally, Anahita opened her eyes. Vega flapped her wings as if to gesture toward her hall. 2 fat ducks lay on the sand, and some sort of scurrying creature Anahita could not identify, all dead. "You've been a busy girl. Which would you like?" Anahita asked, reaching out to stroke the eagle's feathers. Vega cocked her head to one side, so that one fiery eye could better regard Anahita. Animals did not understand the nuances of likes and dislikes. Spending so much time among humans without an animal to talk to, she'd forgotten. "Which is the tastiest?" Anahita asked instead. Vega did not reply. She closed her beak around the dead scurrier's neck and tugged it closer to herself, opening her wings in a protective mantle over her meal. "Good choice. Thank you for the ducks then. They will break my fast nicely." Anahita reached for them, only to realize there was something else she'd forgotten. Her splintered arm was a pointed reminder about the previous night's events. "I wondered when you would wake," a male voice said. Reflex made Anahita reach for a veil to cover her face, but Haidar shook his head. "No need for that. Assad and I are no longer men. That bastard Fari saw to that." He spat on the ground at the mention of the man's name. "May he rot in hell like all the damned for what he did to our village." "What did he do?" Anahita ventured, though she suspected she knew. "A few of his men attacked our camp at dusk, luring our warriors out of the village. As the 2 best warriors, my father left us behind to guard the women and children until they returned. But no one returned, and he had an army hidden in the dunes that descended on us when it was dark. Assad and I are good, but not against so many. He and his men captured everyone who was left and dragged them back to his camp, even the girl children. He used the little ones first, making us carry out the corpses once he'd finished taking his pleasure of them. I thought he was a demon then, before he started on the women. And my wife." "Which one is your wife?" Anahita asked. Haidar just shook his head and buried his head in his hands. Assad approached. Haidar's wife was with child. That bastard tried to cut the child out of her before he took his pleasure of her. She bled to death beneath him in his bed, before he made us carry the corpse out. I'd never been so happy not to marry, but my sisters, We buried them all until we were the only ones from our village left alive. He was preparing to attack another camp when you arrived and distracted him." Asad shuddered. Anahita was silent for a long moment. Finally she said, "Why did you stay with him? I understand wanting to protect what was left of your people, but if you are all that is left." "Because we're slaves. Escaped slaves now. Anyone may kill us on sight, or return us to his camp." She wet her lips. "But his last order was to guard me, was it not? Take me home to my father, and I will see to it that you are freed. Then you may serve whoever you please, for you will be free men again." Haidar let out a hollow laugh. "We are no longer men, and we will never be free. My wife and unborn child will haunt me until the day I die." Asad nudged him. "Anything is better than serving the man who killed them. Where does your father live?" Anahita smiled faintly. "My father has a grand palace in the capital." Asad swore, then apologized. "What manner of man sends his daughter to marry a dog like Fari?" "My father has many daughters. I am the least of them, for my mother was a concubine and not one of his wives. I think he hoped my marriage would bring peace to the desert, to further his trade interests. And perhaps I will, though not the way he thought." Anahita smiled more broadly at that. Playing at politics was the sort of thing Maram did, not a nobody like her. Haidar fell to his knees on the sand and bowed until his forehead touched the ground. He gestured for Asad to do the same. "Then we will serve you, for we owe you a debt. We swore vengeance on Fari, both of us, yet it was you who exacted it. Free or enslaved, we serve you." Anahita shook her head. "When we reach my father's palace, I will return to the harem, where no men are allowed to enter. You are fighters, warriors, protectors, enlist in my father's guards. He always needs more good men." Haidar lifted his head. "We are no longer men. Fari took from us what you took from him." It took Anahita a moment to understand what he meant, though he'd said the words before. "You mean he cut off your—" She couldn't utter the words. "He made eunuchs of us, yes," Asad supplied. "Guards of his harem. Guarding them against everything except that which would kill them, him." Anahita didn't know what to say. What did you say to a man who'd had his manhood forcibly removed? Or lost everything he loved, and been forced to serve the man who'd destroyed it? "Man or not, I vow on my wife's grave that no man will ever hurt you again while I live," Haidar said. He grinned. "My wife would have taken great pleasure in seeing what you did to his corpse." "And I," Asad added. "Now all we need to do is get home," Anahita said. "We will get you there or die trying," Haidar promised. "What is your name, lady?" "Anahita," she said slowly, "but in the harem I was just Anna." She stared down at the rough robes she'd donned to cover herself against the fierce desert sun. She might be a sultan's daughter, but now she was no different to these two men, all fugitives in the desert. "Just Anna," she repeated softly. 8. As Philemon returned to his apartments, he found his people staring at him. They'd all heard his argument with the enchantress then. "I will address the people of the city at sunset, in the great hall cavern," he said, repeating the words over and over as he ascended the tunnels to his own dwelling. It wasn't until he reached the privacy of his own chambers that he allowed his stiffened shoulders to slump as despair overwhelmed him. What was he to do now? Philemon heard the crash of the main gate slamming open. No one but the Jinn door guardian should have been able to do that. A lesser man would have sent a servant to investigate, but Philemon was the Prince of Tasnim, and he would confront this threat head-on. He rubbed the ring, summoning the Jinn guardian. Just because he wasn't a coward, didn't mean he was stupid. The entry hall was full of dust, turning the people running through it into ghosts and shadows. But ghosts and shadows bent under the weight of whatever it was they carried. Philemon's blood ran cold. "They can't leave. Don't let them take my treasures," he shouted. "As you command, master," the djinn said, bowing before disappearing into the gloom. "Wait. You have to close the door." Philemon called, but the djinn evidently hadn't heard him, for he didn't return. "I would only open it again. You can't keep these people here to die," a female voice said. "The enchantress." She strode out of the dust, haloed against the open doorway like some sort of avenging angel. Philemon shrank away from the fury written across her face. "You don't deserve this city or my help, or any magical assistance at all. You demanded my assistance, then lied to me, blaming the dried-up wells on everything but your own stupidity. The djinn of the lamp told me everything. You commanded the djinn of the lamp to destroy your own water supply, not some imaginary enemy. Even after I sent him back into exile, you dared to refuse payment for my services. To evict me from your city. It is your city no longer. Your people flee for the source of its wealth, the water is gone and they cannot live here anymore. You deserve this." Philemon couldn't help himself. "The djinn tricked me. He didn't tell me making that oasis would drain the city wells dry. My princess will never marry me if I am the prince of a city of no people. Make him fix it. Or use your powers to fix it." Lady Zuleika shook her head. "I do not take orders from you, Prince of Tasnim. Or should that be Prince of a dead, dry cave?" "Fix it," he shouted. "You said you would help me." "I did help you. And I will do you one further favor. The only way for you to understand what has happened to your city's water supply is to inspect it personally, and you shall." Purple light erupted from her hands, knocking him back against the wall of the well. But the magic kept pushing at him, leaning him back, until Philemon screamed as he fell backward into the well, arms flailing for something to stop him from falling to his death, but the well somehow gaped impossibly wide and he could not grasp anything. The fall should have killed him, but it just knocked the wind out of him, so all he could do was lie there on his back in a shallow puddle, listening to the sounds of his people deserting him. A head appeared above. Hers, of course. "Fix your own plumbing problem. But even then, no woman in her right mind will want a toad like you, prince or not. If you ever find some princess who will take pity on you, take you to her bed and willingly lie in your slimy arms until dawn, maybe you'll find it in my heart to make you human again. For her sake." And then she was gone. Philemon reached for his ring of office, to summon the door guardian to lift him out of the well. But his fingers were bare, the ring had somehow fallen off. He screamed in frustration, a sound that should have echoed around the underground chamber, striking fear in every heart. But the only sound he heard was a forlorn croak. 9. Anahita was naked, covered in blood, and Fari came for her again, his body glowing red in the light, his jutting cock as long as he was tall. She screamed, and once she started she couldn't seem to stop. A hand came from nowhere, pressing down on her mouth so hard she swore there would be a fresh bruise to add to those Fari had already given her. She flailed about, trying to fight her way free. "Hush, Lady Anahita, you are safe. We swore an oath, but we cannot keep it if you scream so loud everyone in the desert hears you." She knew that voice. Anahita blinked her eyes open to make sure. Yes, it was Haidar. She blew out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said shakily. "I dreamed." Haidar cut her off. "As we all do." He grimaced. "There are some hours to go before nightfall, when we will travel under the cover of darkness again. Try to sleep, for you will need your strength." She shook her head. "I cannot. Not after such a dream. If his men come after us..." "They will not. And even if they do, they will not get past Asad and I, Haidar said. It was on the tip of her tongue to say that Haidar hadn't been able to protect his own wife, the woman he loved, when Fari's men had come for her, but she had no desire to remind the man of his loss. Instead she said, I got past you. To kill, to kill. She couldn't even say the sheikh's name, though she had only to close her eyes to see his evil grin, gleaming above that monstrous cock. You were not a threat, Haidar said. She glared at him. Enough of a threat to kill him. Because he did not see you as a threat either, Haidar replied. If you came at me with a knife, you would not kill me so easily. He gazed at her as though sizing her up for something. If you truly do not think you can sleep anymore, perhaps you should try. He produced a knife from nowhere and offered it to her, hilt first. Anahita took it. The blade was barely bigger than her eating knife, much smaller than the one she'd killed her husband with. Haidar backed out of the tent and beckoned for her to join him. There is more space for a blade dance out here. It took Anahita longer to join him between her broken arm and what she suspected were also broken ribs, but no matter how much she hurt, something within her would not let her back down from this fight. She refused to let any man dictate what she could or could not do, ever again. She stood for a moment, taking in Haidar's relaxed stance as the afternoon sun set his face aglow. Then she rushed at him, raising the knife above her head. His arm shot out and slammed against her wrist, sending the blade spinning across the sand. Her wrist throbbed, already covered in dark bruises from Fari, and she cradled it to her chest, fighting back tears. She met Haidar's gaze squarely, refusing to bow her head. He was the one to look away first, striding across the sand to retrieve his knife. Anahita expected him to tuck it back into its sheath, but he held it out to her instead. When she wrapped her fingers around the hilt, he shook his head. No, you're holding it wrong. It's easy for someone to knock it out of your hand if you do it like that. Haidar wrapped a warm hand around hers, showing her how it should be done. And don't hold the knife up high like you did just then. He'll see you coming and have plenty of time to defend himself. Strike from below, like you did the first time. If he doesn't see it coming, he won't block, and your blade will have a better chance of finding its mark. A man rarely looks at what is under his nose, and if you extend the line of his nose down to the ground, you will see where he is blind. He drew a line down his nose and pointed at a spot on the ground. That is where you lift your blade to do the most damage. He wrapped his hand around Anahita's and brought the blade up to his throat. Or keep it low to hit his heart or his belly. He touched the blade tip to those places on his body, then released her. Now try it again. She did, and he corrected her, a sequence they repeated over and over until he was satisfied. Anahita tried to hand his knife back, but Haidar refused to accept it. Instead, he produced the sheath and insisted she wear it now she knew how to use it. Thank you, she said in wonderment. Are you finished with your foolishness now, so that we can be on our way? Asad asked. Teaching her how better to defend herself is not foolishness, Haidar objected. She has a broken arm and plenty of other bruises from the bastard's blows. She wouldn't last 5 minutes in a proper fight. Asad pointed at the fire. You'd be better off teaching her how to cook. Now that's a more womanly skill. She killed a man with that broken arm and the other injuries. You couldn't have done it, Haidar said. Asad shrugged. I don't have the advantage of being a tiny girl. He's beaten into submission more nights than that bastard could count. She surprised him, that's all. And us, Haidar said. You never saw it coming either, or you wouldn't have let her take your blade. Next time she may need more than the element of surprise. She's as much a warrior as any of our people were. She's not Nasreen, Asad said softly. Your wife is dead, cousin. Nothing you do now can change that. Haidar brought up his stubborn chin. You think I don't know that? That tiny girl avenged Nasreen and all our people. Her. Not you or me. And she did it after a beating, with a broken arm. That takes courage. You swore to protect her, just as I did. Giving her a blade and training her to use it is part of that oath. You're still a fool. Assad turned away to put some more kindling on the fire. I'd rather learn to fight than to cook, Anahita said. I will sleep more soundly for it, even after I am home. Besides, it is Vega and I who do the hunting. It is only fitting that someone else cooks our catch. Haidar burst out laughing. The lady is right. A true huntress, and she has trained that bird well. Anahita considered telling them that she hadn't trained Vega at all, but she wasn't sure how they would react to her ability to speak to animals. Best to keep that a secret a little longer. So shall we practice some more while Assad makes our breakfast? Anahita ventured with a hopeful smile. As my lady commands, Haidar said with a bow. Neither of them paid any attention to Assad's grumbled complaints as he threaded meat onto a knife to cook over the fire. 10. When Anahita lifted her gaze to survey the open city gates, she nearly wept for joy. Never had she seen anything so beautiful as that dusty portal. And yet, a princess did not weep before her people, so her tears died the dry death that befell all who did not know the ways of the desert. Stop, she commanded, and Assad and Haidar did. More than that, they stared at her in surprise. She summoned the same courage that had driven her to seize the knife that set her free and said, "This is my father's city. The people must make way for his daughter. One of you must go before me and the other behind, as befits a princess." She moistened her lips. All the way to the Sultan's palace. My home. Haidar coughed, but Assad laughed outright. Do you truly expect us to believe that? The Sultan would not sacrifice his daughter to an animal like Sheikh Fari. Tell us the truth now, Anna. Which house really belongs to your father? If they didn't believe her, who would? My father is the Sultan, and you will address me as Your Highness Princess Anahita. At least until you are free and our bargain is fulfilled. Haidar wouldn't meet her eyes. And if the guards do not let us into the palace? She had not come this far to be denied her home. Then you will tell them to fetch Princess Maram. My sister will recognize me and take me to my father. Haidar grasped her arm. What will you tell the Sultan? Panic widened his eyes. Anahita shook off his hand. I will tell him the truth. That Sheikh Fari is dead at my hand. My father sent me to forge peace with the sheikh, and so I have. He will never attack our people again. Now please pretend you are my official guards and make the people make way for their princess. Haidar grinned. Never thought I'd get to meet the Sultan. Go on, Assad. You heard the princess. You lead the way, shouting orders to her people. I'll keep watch from the back. And if the Sultan has us killed? Assad hissed, not convinced. Haidar's grin never wavered. It is a better death than what we faced in the desert. We should have died with our people. The only reason we're alive now is because Anna stole your knife. She's not afraid of the Sultan. How are you going to live out the rest of your life, knowing you have less courage than that girl? Assad glared at his cousin. If this is a ploy so that you can see Nasreen sooner, I will torment you in the afterlife. I swear it. You will never know a moment's peace. Then he took his place before Anahita and drew in a deep breath. Make way for the princess, he bellowed. Make way for Her Highness Princess Anahita. Anahita straightened her shoulders, wishing she was taller and more impressive, and followed Assad into the city. The palace gates presented no problem, and they walked straight in. It wasn't until Anahita reached the audience chamber that she realized today must be a public audience day, for the hall was packed. Now what? Assad whispered. Anahita unfastened the straps that held Vega to her. "Fly home and see that the falconer gives you a good dinner," she said, lifting her arm high so that the bird might fly. Vega did not hesitate, soaring over the palace to where her meal awaited. If everything went well, Anahita would hunt with her again on the morrow. If not, "We seek an audience with my father." "Make the crowd part," she said, praying they would. The rest of the city had responded as though she was Maram, and not some forgotten concubine's daughter. A path opened, and Anahita plunged ahead, her men trailing behind her. When she reached the foot of her father's dais, she threw herself down on the floor, blessing the cool marble beneath her forehead. She raised her voice, "Father, I bring news. Sheikh Fari is dead." Silence fell over the hall, stretching for an eternity. Anahita didn't dare look up. Then she heard the rustle of her father's robes. "Today's audience is at an end. Return tomorrow." The sounds of a herd of grumbling, shuffling people echoed off the arched ceilings, so only Anahita and those closest to the Sultan heard his words, "Have refreshments brought to my private chambers. I will speak to her there." Servants helped Anahita to bathe and dress in finer clothes than she'd ever worn before. Long silken sleeves hid her bandaged arm, now wrapped in fresh linen, as gentle hands combed and oiled her hair. It was like being a bride all over again, but there was no fear in her belly this time. Only determination. When she reached her father's chamber, Anahita prostrated herself again. "When I announced I was sending one of my daughters to Fari to be his bride, I was advised that I was sending the girl to her death. I was begged to reconsider, for the only language the sheikh understood was violence. But I kept my word and you were sent. Now you return bringing word of the sheikh's death. Such a thing is impossible. Therefore I ask you to explain how it is possible." "A miracle," Anahita said weakly. The Sultan sighed. "Get up, girl. I can't hear you when you talk to my rug. Now tell me everything. Did you marry the man?" Anahita rose and met her father's eyes. The eyes of the man who had sent her to be beaten to death by Fari. Haidar was right, she'd faced death in Fari's eyes and she had no fear left for her father, the man who'd sentenced her to that fate. She settled herself on a cushion and poured herself a cup of whatever her father was drinking. She drank half of it down, barely tasting the cold juice, for there was not enough sweetness in the world to dull the bitterness on her tongue. Anahita took a deep breath and told her tale. She left nothing out. Not one blow or the trials she and her men had endured in the desert. Until finally she was done. Her father opened his mouth to respond. Perhaps she was not done after all. "Sheikh Fari deserved his fate, and if you marry me to a pig like that again, I swear I will gut him like the animal he is too," she said fiercely, then added almost as an afterthought, "Father." "Anna," a female voice shrieked, and a flash of silk and gold flew across the room to embrace Anahita. "You're alive." Anahita wanted to warn her sister about her broken arm, but despite Maram's apparent excitement, she had taken great care not to touch Anahita's right arm. Realization dawned. Maram knew all that had been said and done since Anahita entered the palace, and she'd chosen her time of arrival perfectly. Maram's tone was one of girlish delight. "Father, you must give her the apartment beside mine. The harem is for virtuous wives, not the likes of us. What reward did you offer the two heroes who carried her home to us?" If Anahita had not known before, now she was certain Maram's spies had told her everything. For she had not seen Haidar or Assad since the throne room. She opened her mouth to ask, but both her father and Maram seemed to have forgotten her. No, not Maram, who broke from her chatter to say, "Oh, you must be exhausted. Go and rest, the chamber's beside mine, mind, not in the harem. I must discuss my new jewels with father, but when we are done, I will come to you directly." Dismissed by her own sister. Anahita was too tired to protest. She followed a servant to her new chamber, only to find it larger than the one she and Maram had shared in the harem. But the size didn't matter, all she cared about was the bed, that heavenly soft surface that embraced her as it promised rest. It seemed but a moment since she'd closed her eyes, but the stiffness of Anahita's limbs told a different story. It was Maram's voice that had woken her, her sister sounding annoyed, which didn't happen often. "Don't be ridiculous. She is my sister. You wouldn't deny me the chance to be reunited with my dearest sister, who I thought I would never see again?" Maram wheedled. Haidar sounded chagrined. "No, mistress, I mean highness, but our job is to protect Princess Anahita, and unless she says she wants to see you." A long pause, and Anahita imagined he shrugged. "My deepest apologies." Anahita staggered to her feet. "Let her in," she said hoarsely, then swallowed and repeated the words. Haidar stuck his head through the doorway. "Are you sure? I think she's trying to cast some sort of spell. She's bitten her lip bloody. I wouldn't want you to come to harm. First day officially on the job and all, but I'm not that stupid." "Spells? Maram. Seduction spells surely. Would they work on a eunuch?" Anahita was one of the few who knew of Maram's magical talents, for she'd seen her use them often enough. "Maram, stop. Boys, please let her in. She's telling the truth. Maram means me no harm," she said. All three of them entered the room, to Maram's obvious annoyance. "I will not tolerate the presence of that man's sworn men," Maram said loftily, dismissing them with a wave of her hand. "Begone. We are sworn to the Sultan now, more than ever before. The only oath I swore to that whoreson was that he'd die screaming, drowning in his own blood. So when Princess Anahita here delivered the blow that fulfilled my oath, we became her men. Until death." Haidar bowed in Anahita's direction, and Asad did the same. Only then did Anahita realize they wore guard uniforms, instead of the clothes they'd arrived in. "But you're free, aren't you?" she asked. Asad laughed. "Free as we ever were. But oaths are tricky things, best not broken. Our village is gone, and we have nowhere else to go. Palace guard seemed like a good idea. Especially if we're to protect the princess outside the harem." Maram gasped. "They're common desert herders? And your lovers? Are they any good?" Her gaze raked over Asad, then Haidar. It was Anahita's turn to gasp. "Surely you haven't taken a lover? Not after your mother?" Maram smiled. "Ah, you haven't heard. Of course I have. While you were off adventuring in the desert, I have been training to become a courtesan. The best the world has ever known. For it will soon be my turn to travel as father's ambassador to far-off lands. I would have gone sooner, but father hesitated, doubting my advice. Now you have returned, he will not doubt me again. I told him Fari could only be stopped with weapons. He should have believed me. Sent an army instead of you." Her hands fluttered in genuine distress. "Is it true that he broke your arm? Where else are you hurt?" Anahita waved her away. "I'm healing fine. Besides, you don't want to hear about my blisters from walking across the desert. Instead, tell me about your travels. Will you go north to where ice falls from the sky?" "I hope so." Maram's eyes lit up. "Oh, you would not believe half the things Mistress Kuhn has taught me. 1,000 ways to seduce a man, and 1,000 more to enslave him without his knowledge." Asad hurried out of the room, followed by Haidar. Maram smothered a laugh. "There. It is good to have you home, Anna. I thought I'd lost you forever. Now will you tell me about your lovers?" Anahita shook her head. "Asad and Haidar aren't my lovers. They're eunuchs, men Fari enslaved from the camps he slaughtered. I've told my tale to father, and I'm sure you heard all I have to tell. But you have done so much since I left. What of your lovers? Maram blushed. Well? Anahita listened, entranced, as Maram spun a tale that seemed like an airy fantasy, of men who could make her body sing, as she learned the arts to bring a man pleasure in equal measure. Yet even as Maram spoke, Anahita fervently wished that such men did exist. Somewhere. 11. Philemon feverishly searched every inch of the cavern twice over, and still he did not find the ring. He shouted until he was hoarse, but only ominous silence greeted him from above. He feared the city was empty but for him. And the water beneath it was draining away. Even now, the pool that had broken his fall had dried to a couple of shallow puddles. No matter how high he leaped, he could not catch the lip of any of the wells, which taunted him from above. But he would not die down here. He was a prince by all that was holy. If he could not return to the city, then he would find another way. The water here had traveled some sort of path between the city and the oasis, and where water went, so could he. He'd follow the water to the oasis and make his way back to the city across the desert. He set off along the tunnels, following the sound of flowing water in the darkness. If he faltered, he only had to remind himself that he was not destined for an ignominious end, all alone in the tunnels beneath his city. As long as he lived, so did Tasnim. Step after tentative step, he would reach the oasis. Hours passed, or perhaps it was days. The darkness was as timeless as the desert above, but it would not defeat him. When he finally did stop, it was because water barred his way. Not the puddles and shallow stream he'd splashed through, but a pool so deep he could not see the bottom. Yet the water glowed as if lit by some magical underground sun. No, not an underground one, he realized. One that burned down from the sky above. He'd found the oasis, but he would have to swim to reach it. So be it. The water was cool against his skin, a sweet caress urging him on. He swam for longer than he expected, but not so long that he felt the burn in his lungs from holding his breath too long. When he surfaced into brilliant sunlight, he let out a shout of triumph. No witch would be the end of him. Was it his imagination, or did the oasis appear bigger than before? Philemon wasn't sure, but the swim seemed to take as long as his walk through the tunnels. But determination drove him, now more than ever before, and he reached the shore. Desert sand compressed underfoot, gritty and crumbling between his toes. Ha! He must have lost his shoes somewhere in the dark and not noticed until now. Philemon glanced down, but he couldn't see his toes through the dislodged dust swirling through the water. He stepped out. Pain burned the soles of his feet, like the fires of hell itself. He bit back a scream and hurled himself back into the water. Slowly, the fire in his feet extinguished in the lapping waters of the oasis. He would bind his feet with scraps of cloth torn from his robes the way beggars did, Philemon told himself. Beggars in other cities, for there were none in Tasnim. He reached for the hem of his robe, but he clutched only air. Now he looked down again, really looked, and this time he couldn't tear his eyes away. No amount of water could hide the green tint to his skin, or the peculiar shape of his feet. Philemon held his hands up to his face, praying that they would be normal, but his prayers were not answered. His green hands had only 4 fingers each. A toad, the witch had called him, not a prince. She'd turned him into one. He let out a scream of fury, but all that came out was a croak. Swearing he'd hunt down the witch and force her to fix the mess she'd made, he sank beneath the surface. Watching. Waiting. For frogs could not survive in the desert alone, he would need to find a traveling party to join to take him back to Tasnim. Or better yet, to where he could find the witch. A caravan would come, he told himself with confidence. And when it did, he would be ready. 12. I have not left the palace for weeks, and now Vega's found herself a mate. She's not leaving the nest anytime soon. I want to go hunting, and to hunt I need a new bird. A hawk this time, smaller than Vega, and not so heavy. Anahita looked from Haidar to Asad. I saw a new caravan come into the city last night. A new caravan means new birds, or at least I hope so, and who knows what else. Who's coming? Asad and Haidar exchanged a glance. As long as we don't end up spending hours at the goldsmith again, Asad began. We weren't there for hours. And it would have been a much shorter visit if you hadn't been fondling that new blade of yours and scaring the man, Anahita said. I was testing the edge. Haidar protested. Testing the edge while wagering how many blows it would take to cut a man's hands off. Anahita set her hands on her hips. I still don't believe you could do that in one stroke. All that bone, it would take at least 2. It only took 1 to deal with that thief who tried to take your purse last time, Asad said. Anahita waved his words away. That was you with your sword. Not Haidar with a knife. And you took off half his arm, not just his hand. Please don't do that again. Asad looked aghast. You'd prefer to let thieves steal from you? Your father would assign you a squad of guards, convinced we are not capable of protecting you. I'd prefer not to have a screaming man lying at my feet, bleeding all over the place while the marketplace erupts into chaos and closes before I have finished my shopping, Anahita said dryly. You shall have it. Now no one dares get close enough to us to risk losing their arm too, Asad said. Anahita nodded. She had to admit, he had a point. Better that they had a reputation for being fearsome than having to deal with a squad of her father's guards, like Maram did, or being forced to defend herself. If a princess hacked off someone's hand in the marketplace, father would never marry another daughter off again. Though that might not be a bad thing. Anahita mentally shook herself. Just because she only knew the undesirable kind of husbands, did not mean her sisters could not be happily married to good men. Fari had been the worst, but her other 3 husbands had not been much of an improvement. Well, unless you counted the fact that all 3 had not had the opportunity to enjoy married life for very long, and she'd been widowed without any broken bones or significant bruises. True to his word, Haidar had taught her well. So well that she was never without a blade or 3 within reach. Have you changed your mind? Haidar asked. He read her expression well. As he should, after so many years together. No. Just, a widow's memories are not always pleasant, she said. Asad laughed. Inside her palace apartments, he knew better than to speak freely, for every wall had ears. He would have to wait until they went hunting to say what was on his mind. And he would, she was certain. For though they kept up the facade of mistress and her sworn men, they were her friends more than anything. The only 2 truly good men she'd ever met, eunuchs or not. Maram laughed at her cynicism, as well she might, for Maram charmed men as easily as breathing. But Maram was off traveling again, on some diplomatic mission for her father. Furthering trade somewhere in the far north, where ice lay on the ground for half the year. Anahita shivered at the very thought of it. She was a desert princess, only comfortable when the heat rising up from the sands was warmer than her blood. And boats? Ugh! Give her a camel any day, a creature she could communicate with that would do whatever she said. But today was for birds, not camels. So are you coming? She asked. Despite their initial grumbling, once they were in the bazaar, both men spent more time looking at the wares for sale than she did. Strange foreign blades, cloth so heavy it was a wonder anyone could walk while wearing it, these must have come by ship from the northern lands. She prayed they'd brought some new creatures. If not a bird, then perhaps something else. One of the wives in the harem had a particularly fat cat that slept on her bed at night, for she abhorred mice and would go nowhere without the beast. Anahita had often wondered whether her father tolerated the animal on the nights he favored that wife, but she'd never been brave enough to ask. Maram would know. She knew every secret in the harem. Perhaps the ships had brought her home too. But there was no word of Maram's return in the marketplace, as there certainly would be, for she was well known. Instead, the people talked of a sheikh raiding their borders, enslaving those he did not kill. His men had run afoul of a party of crusaders, but the northerners were weak from hunger and war, and the sheikh's men had taken everything from them before leaving them in the desert to die. No one liked the crusaders much, but it was the height of dishonor to let them die in the desert instead of killing them outright. And the stories about this new sheikh made him sound like a second Fari. An affronted shriek drew Anahita's attention from the marketplace gossip. An avian shriek, she was certain, though it didn't sound like a bird she knew. Anahita quickened her pace. She reached the menagerie, only to discover she'd somehow left Asad and Haidar behind. She debated whether to retrace her steps or simply wait for them to appear. "What are you looking for today, mistress?" the stall owner asked, offering her a deep bow. Veiled and shrouded in widow's garb, Anahita didn't bother to correct him. "A hunting bird," she said. The man's eyes widened. "A songbird might amuse you more, mistress. I have here a bird from the far north with a song so sweet, it will bring tears to your eyes." "Her Highness has shed too many tears of grief. She delights in hunting and wishes for your best hawk," Haidar said, appearing at Anahita's elbow. The man threw himself down on the ground, wailing his apologies and other boring things. Anahita's attention was caught by a prickly ball that suddenly moved. It unrolled, revealing a downy belly and pointed face. "What is that?" she asked, pointing. The man clambered to his feet and puffed out his chest. "It is a most rare creature, found only in—" "It's a desert hedgehog," Asad said flatly. "You'll find a dozen of them at any oasis. I'll catch you one next time you go hunting, Your Highness." The man deflated. "I assure you." He was drowned out by a shriek just like the one that had drawn Anahita's attention in the first place. This time she could see the source. And what a source! The hawk was small, her chest patterned in an intricate mosaic of brown, gold and white. She opened her silvery beak to shriek again, flicking her talon at something pink on the floor of her cage. A baby mouse or rat, Anahita decided. "Are dead mice not good enough for you, beautiful?" she asked the bird. "He has given me nothing suitable to eat for many days. I am hungry and this is not food," the little falcon said. "I must be free to fly and hunt." "That is a crusader falcon from the north," the salesman said smoothly. Asad shrugged. "I've never seen a bird like it." "Have you?" Haidar shook his head. She belonged to a foreign king, who gave the bird as a gift to his mistress, who could not bear to look upon the creature after he died valiantly in battle, the salesman continued. "She was taken prisoner by a vicious sheikh, the same man who killed her paramour, and the bird is pining for his mistress. He needs a new mistress as royal as the first. My master sold me to pay his passage on a ship home," the bird said. "He knew good food. Fresh food from the hunt." For once Anahita was glad of her veil, for it hid her smile. "The bird looks thin and hungry. But it's not eating. Is it sick?" The man began to sweat. "If Her Highness wishes for a more robust bird, may I suggest?" "How much for the sick bird?" "For Her Highness, I recommend." Haidar named a price that was far too low for the sweet little falcon. 5 minutes later, they left the stall, with Asad carrying the falcon's cage. Not jewels or silks or the costliest carpet could catch Anahita's eye after that. She made one more stop, at a stall selling snacks and drinks, before demanding that Haidar and Asad accompany her out of the city. She'd made sure to buy a selection of their favorite cakes, so neither man complained as they took her to one of her favorite hunting spots. 13. Darkness had descended by the time Anahita headed back inside the city gates. The guards called a challenge, but the moment they spotted Haidar and Asad, they moved aside, bowing to let them pass. Anahita cradled her new bird to her chest, stroking her feathers as the falcon slept off her fresh-caught feast. Anahita had never seen a bird fish before, but this one seemed born to it, plucking fish and frogs out of the oasis faster than she'd seen her little brothers gobble treats. The bird had laid the first corpses at her feet, and Anahita had thanked her, before telling her she could eat her fill today without needing to share. As they passed through the bazaar, now lit by torches and busier than ever, there was a buzz that had nothing to do with some sheikh or rumors of distant battles. No, this was the buzz of energy that only came when Maram arrived home. Some claimed they had seen her, while others swore they would line the streets on the morrow, hoping to catch a glimpse of her on her way to the public bathhouse that would be closed for her private use. Anahita had no idea why her sister chose to patronize the ancient public bathhouse instead of the perfectly private one in the palace, but the people loved that she did. Anahita had her own reasons to be happy Maram was home. She would have stories to tell about her travels, gifts she'd been given by the people of the various courts she'd visited, and as the Sultan's favorite daughter, her apartments were as opulent as a queen's. So when Anahita joined her for dinner this evening, as she always did when Maram was home, it would be a far pleasanter affair than eating alone, for Haidar and Asad weren't supposed to share her meals. And of course Maram had charmed the palace cooks like she did everyone else, so the delicacies at her table outshone even the Sultan's feasts. Not to mention the exotic things she brought home from her travels. The next morning found her fuzzy-headed from the strong berry wine Maram had generously plied her with, but the fuzziness faded fast when Haidar opened the door to her chamber. "A message from the Sultan, Your Highness," he said gravely. The message was important enough to be delivered by one of the Sultan's wives. Anahita's heart sank. She was usually beneath the notice of the wives, except when a marriage was in the wind. Then, the highest-ranking wife delivered the order. Unwillingly, Anahita sank to her knees. "Your Majesty," she murmured. It was a safer bet than remembering the woman's name. The wife flashed her teeth in a mirthless smile. "Princess, you are commanded to travel to the camp of Sheikh Basit, where you will become his bride. You will depart in a week." Anahita grimaced. While she didn't know this woman's name, Basit was the name that had been on everyone's lips in the marketplace yesterday. Her father intended to send her to her death again. Would he ever learn? Or perhaps he liked things this way. Anahita mumbled something about how grateful she was to the wife and the Sultan for making this match for her. Whatever she said, it met with the wife's satisfaction, and she left. The door clicked shut, and only then did Anahita let rip with the most colorful swear words she could come up with at this latest development. "Another marriage?" She looked up. Asad had managed to enter the room on Hunter's feet, silent as ever. "To Sheikh Basit." He nodded. Another bastard, no doubt. The marketplace was abuzz about him. "When do we leave?" Anahita didn't hesitate. 5 days. Before Father's official party is prepared, so it's just the 3 of us. Can you tell Haidar? Asad bowed, grinning. Of course. He'll be as happy to get out of the palace as I am. Are you bringing your new bird? Anahita felt a pang of regret, not taking Vega with her for the first time. But Merlin, the frog-hunting falcon, would be a suitable companion for the journey. Of course I'm taking my bird. Someone has to take her hunting. Think of all the oases on the way. I hope Princess Maram brought home some barbarian recipes for cooking frogs then, Asad called back as he left. Ugh. Merlin could keep her frogs. Anahita wasn't letting one near her lips, cooked or otherwise. 14. This is new. See the color of the water? It has not lain here long. And there are no trees yet, though those will grow. Asad nodded at a clump of tiny date palms. We will camp here for the night, he said, and neither Haidar or Anahita argued. Anahita eyed the sparkling water, clearer than the other muddy oases they'd seen along the way. She longed to bathe after so many days collecting dust as they traversed the desert, and this oasis looked too tempting to resist. Haidar seemed to have read her mind. You bathe while we set up camp. Then that bird of yours can hunt while we start a fire to cook whatever it catches. Don't let her cook it or she'll poison us all, Asad said. They all laughed. None of them would ever forget Asad's failed attempts to teach her to cook. Anahita could manage 2 cooking styles, charred or raw, neither of which was particularly edible. I wager that bird of yours won't catch much. The oasis is too new for anything to live in it yet. Perhaps in a few seasons you will have better luck. Good thing I have plenty of dried meat to season the stew, Asad continued. I'll take that wager, Haidar said smoothly. Desert creatures find water faster than you give them credit for. And that bird has sharper eyes than your dull ones. Anahita left the boys to bicker while she went to bathe. She stripped off her clothes, folding them beside the water's edge, and stepped into the water's embrace. It was colder than she'd expected, especially after being warmed all day by the sun. For all that it was a new oasis, the waters must run deep to stay so cool. She immersed herself fully, gasping as it felt like cold fingers reaching for her, stroking away the dust and sweat of the journey as she plunged in deeper. Your bird's getting jealous, Asad shouted. Reluctantly, Anahita set her feet on the lake bed and turned to see what the fuss was about. Frog! Frog! Merlin screeched, flapping her wings. Set her free, Anahita commanded, striding out of the water. She looked at her discarded clothes for a moment, before deciding she wanted fresh things. She rummaged through her bags, seeking something practical among the finery. By the time she dug out a suitable tunic, the warm desert wind had dried her skin, so it was a simple matter to slip the garment over her head. When she turned around, she found Haidar's eyes fixed on her, though he had a faraway look on his face. What is it? She asked softly, keeping her voice low so that Asad would not hear. Haidar shook his head and seemed to see her again. Forgive me, but you reminded me of happier times. Time spent with his wife Nasreen, she knew. If I could return her to your arms and make you whole again, I would. You know that. Haidar sighed deeply. I know. As would I. But sometimes I wonder if I am a fool for not. An unearthly shriek split the air as Merlin erupted from the oasis, beating her wings frantically. She flew erratically, lurching from one side to another, as though she'd drunk too much wine. Merlin, come here, she called. The bird moved toward her, still flying clumsily, and Anahita kept talking, reassuring the bird until Merlin flopped in a heap at Anahita's feet. Forgetting everything but the bird before her, Anahita knelt down. There was something strange stuck to the bird's face. She reached out to free Merlin. 15. Something warm gently tugged at his hand, unfastening it from his death grip around the bird's neck feathers. He struggled to keep his legs wrapped around that deadly beak, but that slid out of his grasp too, as he was surrounded by something warm and soft. It almost reminded him of that night 2 of his concubines had agreed to share him, and his bed had become a paradise of perfumed, female flesh. The annoyed chittering of a bird, the same one who'd tried to eat him, dragged Philemon out of his delightful daydream. His harem was no more. He sighed. You're a strange one, aren't you? A female voice purred. I've never heard a frog sigh before. And Merlin tells me they don't usually scream until her master cuts their legs off. Then Merlin is a barbarian, Philemon declared. She sounded amused. Merlin is a bird. The bird whose face you sat on while you were screaming. Apparently her prey is usually more resigned to their fate, and less inclined to call her names. What sort of frog are you? Philemon blew out an exasperated breath and dared to open his eyes, only to find another pair, inches from his own. They were the color of a desert oasis, wavering between blue and green like water reflecting the sky and the fringing palm trees. But perfectly calm and still, as though it didn't bother her in the slightest that she held a frog in her cupped hands, both hands, for they were not large, as she conversed with him. The bird's barbarian mistress, Philemon decided, for she wore no veil over her dark hair, and her face was bare for all to see. "I am not a frog at all but a prince under a terrible curse," he announced. The girl chuckled, a deeper sound than he'd expected from such a small woman. "And did the curse also turn your vast kingdom into that tiny oasis? Are your people swimming about as fish in that water?" Philemon cast her a scornful glance. "Of course not. That's a story for children, which my mother told me when I was a boy. I am Prince Philemon of Tasnim, a ruler in my own right, and one of the richest men in the region, if not the world." When she seemed unable to reply, too humbled by his high stature he supposed, Philemon graciously added, "You may address me as your highness." Those blue-green eyes danced. "I don't think I will, Philemon the frog. But my sisters call me Anahita or simply Anna, and you may too." Definitely a barbarian, who had no respect for rank. Philemon sniffed. "You must take me to find the cruel enchantress who cast this terrible curse. When she sees the error of her ways and lifts the curse, you will see me in my true glory and apologize for your disrespect, for which I will forgive you." She nodded gravely. "A kind offer, I'm sure, but one I won't accept. I have a wedding to attend, Philemon, and unless your enchantress intends to be one of the wedding guests, you won't find her with me. I will just have to live without your forgiveness." She set him down on the sand and started to walk away. "Wait." The word was out of his mouth before Philemon could stop it. She was the first person he'd seen since leaving Tasnim. No one came to this oasis, and if she didn't help him, he might be stuck here for the rest of his life. How long did frogs live for, anyway? Not long, with birds like that monster Merlin around. "You must help me." She stopped. "Why, Philemon the frog? Why must I help you?" He hopped across the burning sand, hissing, before he reached the hem of her robe. He hesitated for only a moment, before hopping onto the toe of her shoe. The relief was immediate, no more burning sand under his backside. "Because I'll die out here if you don't. I cannot leave the oasis, for I would not last long on the desert sands." He swallowed, forcing the words out. "Please take me with you." She cupped him in her hands, lifting him so that they saw eye to eye once more. "So you have some courtesy after all. If you wish me to carry you across the desert, you must pay for your passage, Philemon the frog. What can you offer that might be of value to me?" "A chest of gold from the treasury in Tasnim," he answered instantly. "Enough gold to last you a lifetime." The girl shook her head. "There is no gold here, Philemon the frog. This is not Tasnim, and I will not take you there. For an empty promise, I will take you nowhere." He opened his mouth to protest that it was not an empty promise at all, before he remembered that he might never make it to Tasnim without her help. He swallowed. "Very well. I will be an amusing travel companion, to make your journey easier and more comfortable, and when I reach Tasnim, I will see that you get your gold." Her hands around him felt like pure bliss compared to the baking desert. "If you carry me with you to wherever you are going, I will give you whatever is in my power to grant you." She gave a low whistle. "Gold, a helpful travel companion, and a boon. You offer a great deal for someone so small. It seems almost too good to be true." She turned. "What do you think, Merlin?" Philemon glimpsed the bird, a fiery-eyed hawk, on the ground behind him, and flattened himself against Anahita's hands so that the bird wouldn't see him. The bird let out a shrill chirp. Anahita laughed. "Merlin thinks frogs are only good for eating. Her previous master was fond of the legs, grilled over a fire, and he gave her the rest. Philemon shivered. What sort of barbarian ate frogs? But I prefer duck, Anahita continued, and while I already have all the travel companions I need, one who has new tales to tell would be a welcome distraction. Do you know any amusing tales, Philemon the frog? He had to think about that one. My concubines often complimented me on my wit, the quality of my conversation and the cleverness of my tales, he said finally. They'd also complimented him on his prowess in the bedchamber, but he didn't think this girl was looking for a lover. Her oasis eyes turned cold. Concubines. My, you must have been a mighty prince indeed, ruling over such a harem. I cannot imagine why an enchantress would choose to curse you. Nor I, he said softly, daring to hope. She sighed. Fine, I shall help you. But if you prove to be a nuisance, I will feed you to Merlin. He swallowed, knowing he would regret this. Then we have an accord. 16. Philemon, I have a proposition for you, the girl called. What had her name been? Oh, that's right, Anahita. No title, no family name, just Anahita. He should remember that, in case he ever caught himself thinking about her bathing naked in his oasis again. It had been a long time since he'd seen a woman, let alone a naked one, and her form was pleasing enough to catch the eye of a man starved for female company. Not her face though. Now he'd seen it up close, he thought her plainer than ever. Her nose was crooked, as though it had been broken. Perhaps barbarian girls fought like boys did. And those strange eyes, like one of the crusaders from the north. She was probably the spawn of some crusader and a girl he stole from her family. That she lived meant her mother had lived long enough afterwards to bear the child, probably as a common whore. How low he had fallen. A prince, deigning to listen to a proposition from some whore's bastard daughter. Philemon lifted his head from the water, just enough so that she could see his eyes. Do you now? She smiled. It improved her looks, at least a little. You did say you would make my journey more comfortable, did you not? Philemon let out a noise that sounded alarmingly like a croak. She appeared to take this as assent. You may start by making yourself useful tonight. This lovely oasis of yours is home to a great number of mosquitoes, which have taken up residence in my tent. Given your natural talents with flying things, you shall sit at the end of my bed and keep them from bothering me as I sleep. It was an order, not a request, and as such, it rankled. But they did have a deal, and besides, he had to admit he was hungry. He'd give a whole bag of gold for a well-spiced roast lamb, but his accursed body demanded a different form of sustenance. He raised his head higher, lifting his chin in what he hoped looked like lofty condescension. Carry me to your bedchamber, and I shall protect you in a true princely fashion. She burst out laughing. Philemon glared. What is so funny? She took her time getting control of herself before she finally said, You really shouldn't do that. It only draws attention to that bulging thing under your chin. On a man it would be a prominent Adam's apple, but on a frog it's a vocal sac of some sort. Terribly distracting, especially when you're talking. I'm too worried it will pop like a soap bubble to listen to a word you say. Philemon tucked his chin down firmly. I said carry me to your bed, and I shall protect you in a true princely fashion. She still smiled, but at least she didn't laugh. Well, you should know you'll be the first prince to ever protect me in any fashion. She scooped him up and carried him toward her tent. Philemon had to force himself to hold his tongue. Of course she'd never been protected by a prince before. She'd probably never even met one. But barbarian or not, he had a deal with this girl, and he would honor it, for a prince's honor was a weighty thing indeed. I will need a bucket of water, if you wish me to stay in your tent all night. I cannot be allowed to dry out, so I must immerse myself periodically, he said as the tent flaps closed behind her. She set him on the floor, which was a surprisingly fine carpet. Her bed was equally surprising, as big as his own when he'd traveled, with several cushions that looked to be made of silk. Stolen, he was certain. "I'll go fetch some," she said, heading back out the way she'd come. The moment she was out of sight, he leaped across the carpet for the pallet, aiming for the nearest silk cushion. Oh, how he'd missed the feel of silk against his skin. The only fabric that felt like a woman's caress, which he'd missed for even longer. But the moment his feet touched the cushion, he experienced nothing so sensuous. No, what he felt next could only be described as every bit of his body sneezing at exactly the same time. 17. A normal princess would have brought a maid and a whole troop of servants to see to her needs, Anahita reflected, as she dug through their things for a bucket. A normal princess wouldn't have to find her own bucket, and use it to fetch water for an unusually arrogant frog. But Anahita had never been, and would never be, a normal princess. None of her father's other children had her gift of being able to converse with creatures. In fact, aside from herself and Maram, none of the others seemed to have any magical abilities at all. Which was why Maram was destined to be alone, and if it weren't for Haidar and Asad, Anahita would be too. But the three of them made perfect travel companions because they knew each other so well, and she would trade a whole palace full of servants to take these two men with her. Servants would only complicate matters. So with a sigh, she carried her bucket to the oasis and lugged the slopping load to her tent. For the haughty frog. She shouldn't have agreed to let him come with them. She didn't need another pet, and this one might prove to be a dangerous distraction. Even bringing Merlin with her risked losing the bird, after the way Fari had claimed Vega for his own all those years ago. What if this new sheikh was just as bad, trying to take everything from her so she would be an obedient wife? Two words that should never be used to describe her, obedient or wife. As Fari had found out in his final moments. His lifeblood flowed over her hands again, warm and sticky as the night had happened. For she would never forget. Even her arm ached at the memory. But it was a memory, no more. No man would ever share her bed again. Anahita took a deep breath and another, attempting to calm herself. So that she would not appear agitated in front of a frog. She choked back a laugh. Frogs could not discern facial expressions. She ducked through the tent flaps, stepped inside, then straightened. And stopped dead. The bucket slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, splashing water up to the very roof of the tent, and soaking her to the skin, but Anahita did not feel it. A rich, mellow voice called out, "Why, you are quite the loveliest woman I have ever seen under those shapeless things." Anahita closed her eyes, but she couldn't seem to shut out his voice, which made things curl up in her belly. So she opened her eyes again and took in the scene as Asad had taught her to do. A lean, muscled man, his skin gleaming in the lamplight, reclined on her cushions, his dark eyes gazing on her with obvious approval. Other parts of his anatomy rose to salute her too. Bits she'd hacked off and burned in a brazier. Anahita turned on her heel and marched out of the tent. Asad and Haidar rose from their seats by the fire. "What's wrong?" Haidar asked. "I've never seen you look so pale." Asad squinted at her. "Me neither. Not since that first night when." Haidar waved him into silence, but it was too late. The night Fari died was uppermost in her mind as it was in theirs. Anahita fought to keep her breathing even. "There is a man in my bed. An amorous one." She couldn't suppress a shudder. "There can't be," Asad scoffed. "We've been sitting here all night. No one could have gotten past us and into your tent without us seeing him. You must have imagined him." It wouldn't be the first time she'd imagined such a thing, and they all knew it. Her memories sometimes rose up so strong it would take all three of them to banish them back to the past, where they belonged. But she hadn't known this man. All he'd had in common with her long-dead husband was his mighty erection, and his unwelcome presence in her bed. Anahita lifted a shaky finger and pointed at the tent. "Then you go in there. And tell me what you see, for I will not sleep in that tent unless I know my bed is empty." Haidar led the way. "Real or imaginary, I will remove him. Assad will help, as he's so certain no one could have gotten past him." Anahita folded her arms across her chest and stood by the fire, watching the men enter the tent. The brazier silhouetted them against the tent wall as they leaned down, then came up with a third man between them. A sob escaped from her lips before she got hold of herself. Then she blinked, and 3 men became 2. The mystery man had vanished. "How dare you?" a thin, reedy voice screeched. "The girl herself invited me into her bed. For laying hands on me, I shall have you executed." Faster than any frog should, the creature leaped across the sand and back into the oasis with an audible plop, still grumbling about faithless women, jealous men, and methods of execution. Haidar emerged from the tent, looking disgruntled. "He was here, and we lifted him off your bed, but then it felt like he slipped through my fingers, and now he is gone. Almost as though we all imagined him." Haidar held out his hand. "But my hand is wet, look." Moisture shone in the firelight. "The cushions have wet spots too, look." Assad stuck his head out of the tent flaps and held out a cushion. "I spilled a bucket of water. It probably splashed on them," she said, but not even she believed her own words. Instead, she turned over Philemon's words in her mind. A cursed prince. He might not be a prince, but there was something magical about him. Magic that had made him into a man, if only for a moment. And on the morrow, she would insist he tell her the whole story of how it happened. That would make the unwanted journey go faster. "Well, if he's gone, I'm going to bed," she said, and the 2 men moved aside to allow her entry. Sleep came surprisingly swiftly to her that night. 18. Philemon sat in the water for a long time, seething. How dare those barbarian boys lay hands on him, a prince? If it had been the girl, he might have forgiven her. She was pretty enough to suit his tastes, and for that one glorious moment, he'd been human again. Desire had flared in her eyes for that moment too. He hadn't imagined it. But those men had ruined everything when they seized him, and he'd turned back into a frog. He'd watched them from the water, and he was certain neither was her husband. She moved too freely for a wed woman. The easy familiarity between all 3 of them was the sort he'd known among the city guards before his father had died, and he'd claimed the crown. Like brothers. They could be her brothers, though she was tiny compared to them. The child of a second wife, perhaps. When all 3 of them retired to the same tent, he was certain of it. 2 older brothers protecting their younger sister. An untamed girl who was more than old enough to wed, but had not yet been taught the proper decorum for a married woman. Her husband would see to that, he was sure of it. The men of the desert demanded much of their wives. He'd had concubines like her. Girls their fathers could not find suitable marriages for, so they'd been given to him as part of the price for the hospitality of Tasnim. Girls who had taken to Tasnim like ducks did to water, for Tasnim was different to other desert cities. A city he had to save at any cost, or he had no right to call himself its prince. He could wait in the oasis for a proper caravan, but who knew how long that would take. These 3 were the first travelers he'd seen since he took up residence here, and he had delayed long enough already. He'd struck a bargain with the girl, wild though she was, and something told him she would honor it. But just in case she changed her mind, he would find a place among their things to stow away. The half-filled water bucket outside her tent seemed the most sensible place, he decided, when the night air had cooled the sands enough for him to hop across the camp to investigate. He settled in the bucket to doze until dawn. 19. Avian shrieks and swaying woke Anahita from a sound sleep. She did some swaying of her own as she stuck her head out of the tent into the pre-dawn light, where Merlin appeared to be fighting with the water bucket. "Surrender, foul foe, or I shall drown you," came the reedy voice of Philemon. Merlin's head appeared to be stuck in the bucket. She flapped her wings, lifting herself and the bucket a short distance off the ground, before dropping again. "I do not jest, minion of hell." Anahita strode over to rescue them both. She stuck her hand in the bucket and pulled out the frog, who had his tiny arms around Merlin's head. Again. Sighing, she pried them loose. Merlin flapped away with an indignant squawk, shaking off water. Anahita lifted the frog up so she could look him in the eye. "You're a troublemaker, aren't you?" The frog puffed up in indignation. "I am a troublemaker? What about that dishonorable demon of a bird, attacking a man in his sleep, no less? I was merely defending myself. Why, if I but had my sword." "You have a frog-sized sword? I'd like to see that," Anahita interrupted. Could a frog glare? She suspected that's what he was doing. "A sword fit for a prince from before I was cursed," he said stiffly. Of course." "Of course," she repeated. "Are you sure you want to ride with us, seeing as I travel with Merlin?" He drew himself up. "I am on a quest to save my city from the witch who cursed me. If you had 100 such birds, I would still fight every one of them in order to succeed at my quest. I am a prince." "So you keep saying," Anahita said. "You saw my princely magnificence with your own eyes last night. How can you doubt me?" She burst out laughing. "Princely magnificence? Is that what you call a naked man where you're from? I'm not sure what I saw last night. You're no normal frog, but whether you are truly a frog or a man, I do not know." She thought for a moment, then added, "But no matter what you are, I am certain you will prove an amusing travel companion. You may ride with me today and tell me all about your quest and the city you wish to save." The frog executed a bow, or at least he tried to. "It would be my pleasure." 20. Anahita refused to allow Philemon to ride in a bucket on the back of her camel, where he would be a terrible temptation for her bird, or so she said, so she and Philemon reached a compromise. He rode in the neck of a half-filled water bag that was strapped in front of her saddle. "I feel like a wax stopper," he complained. Veiled against the sand, still she brought her hand to cover her mouth as she giggled. "Most stoppers don't have eyes. Nor are they small enough to slip inside the water bag, if Merlin decides she wants to attack you again." He glanced around, but he could not see the murderous bird. "Where is the creature?" "She's riding with Assad on the lead camel. Leaving me free to listen to your tales while we travel. So tell me about your quest, Philemon the frog." There was little to tell yet, for it had just started. "Have you ever been to Tasnim?" he asked. She shook her head, sending ripples through the white fabric of her veil. It was too big for her, more suited to one of the men she traveled with than a delicate young woman. No wonder she took it off in camp. "This would have been my first time, but the gates were closed to us." Her first journey away from her people, Philemon guessed. Then he registered the rest of her words. The gates of the city were closed. He breathed a sigh of relief. No one would loot the place in his absence. Good. "Until the oasis where you found me formed, Tasnim was the only water source for miles in any direction. An underground citadel in the desert, impregnable and impossible to besiege." He smiled. He was right to be proud of his city. No one knows who built the first tunnels, but it was used in times of war and the ancients kept a permanent garrison there. Some of the city's present-day residents are descended from those soldiers. Even him, for the city's princes had sometimes taken brides from the city people instead of looking further afield, as Philemon had. "We saw no sign of soldiers. No sign of anyone actually, no matter how loudly Haidar knocked at the door. A barbarian girl and her brothers could not afford Tasnim's hospitality, though it was likely there had been no one left in the city to offer it this time. They must have fled the curse, Philemon said. But had they not, they still might not have opened the gates. The price for Tasnim's hospitality is high. Why, I have known men who have sold their daughters to pay the price. Her eyes, the only part of her face he could see, narrowed. Perhaps that is why the witch cursed you and your city. Hospitality is one of the sacred laws of the desert. She was painfully close to the truth and yet so far from it too. We offered her our hospitality, including apartments in my own palace, for a price that should have been a trifle for someone with magic. Yet she refused to cast the spell. She tried to hold us to ransom. Did she turn everyone into frogs? Or just you? Anahita was observant. Too observant. Just me. My people. She let them leave unharmed. So you offended the witch somehow. You must have been particularly rude for her to transform you. I've only heard of a few enchantresses who are capable of such complicated magic, and they would need a really good reason to do it. What did you do, Philemon the Frog? Why must I be guilty? Perhaps the enchantress envied me the wealth of Tasnim, and wished to take the city for herself. Philemon said. Those narrowed eyes did not believe a word of it. Perhaps. What sort of wealth did Tasnim have? It just looked like a pile of rocks in the desert to me. Have you seen the Sultan's palace in the capital? Philemon didn't wait for her answer. Tasnim outshines it tenfold. Maybe more. Even the common people's houses have costly mosaics on the walls. In my own palace, no wall or ceiling is unadorned. Every ruler throughout history has commissioned artwork to commemorate their reign, some of which are in the palace, but many are in the city itself. Why, my great-grandmother, the regent Princess Khurshid, had the ceilings of all the public meeting chambers painted to resemble the sky at different times of day. Dusk and dawn, midnight, noon, the work is exquisite. Even now, gazing up at them, one might think they were standing in the open air instead of beneath a thick layer of stone. So you live in a state of perpetual night underground? She asked. On the upper levels of the city, close to the surface, there are air and light wells that let in sunlight during the day. But everywhere there are lamps, so the city is ablaze whenever light is needed. It is not as bright as the desert sun at noon, but only a madman would wish to be out in such heat. This did not seem to impress her at all. So men sell their daughters into slavery so that you might have light? There are no slaves in Tasnim. No. The girls are given as gifts and I take them into my harem as concubines, Philemon said. If anything, this only seemed to anger her further, as her eyebrows descended even lower. Oh, and being forced to warm your bed is better than slavery. Forced? He'd never forced a woman in his life. His concubines had come willingly to his bed. Had she forgotten what he looked like? He had no need to force women. My concubines were always appreciative of my attentions, he snapped. I'm sure they had little choice in the matter. A concubine who doesn't have her master's favor has little power in a harem, and he may discard her at will. So of course she will lie through her teeth if she has to, just to keep the place she has. For a girl so young, she seemed to have excessively strong opinions about life in a harem. You know nothing about my concubines. Her eyes blazed. No, you know nothing about them. My mother was a concubine, and I grew up in the harem. Saw how they were treated. So don't tell me your concubines were happy, with wives lording it over everyone, knowing you could be cast aside at the merest whim, and there was nothing you could do about it. Perhaps in whatever desert sheikh's harem she had grown up in, but not in a civilized city like Tasnim. I had no wives, and as my concubines, the girls who were given to me were under my protection. unless they chose to marry men of the city. Then their husband became their protector. But some girls preferred the harem, for it was all they had ever known. Anahita had learned to play every musical instrument she could lay her hands on, and her voice soared above them all, like an angel come to earth. If she had to choose between a husband and her harp, she would pick the harp. Anahita's eyes widened. You didn't touch your concubines? It would have been easier to say he hadn't, but he refused to lie to her, even to protect her obvious innocence about the real ways of the world. I lay with those who wished it. Two in particular, Zareen and Simon, were skilled in the arts of love, and took great pleasure in practicing those arts. Why, they knew things I'd never heard of. His mind wandered as he remembered nights spent with Zareen or Simon, or, on rare occasions, both girls together. He sobered when he realized he would probably never see them again. They would be welcomed as courtesans in any court, and never return to him or Tasnim. Finally he said, "But you don't want me to talk about concubines?" He didn't want to think of them, now either. Or all that he had lost. "You're less amusing than I had hoped, Philemon the Frog," she said frostily. He couldn't disagree, so he racked his brain for something the girls had always liked. "Have you heard about the gardens of Tasnim?" 21. Anahita couldn't stop laughing. Why would anyone want a jeweled garden? Why not plants? Trees for shade and flowers for scent, precious metals and jewels have no scent. Plants do not grow underground, you see. Most plants, anyway. There are mushrooms growing in one of the lower caverns, I believe. They fetch quite a high price in the markets, or so I'm told. Anahita knew little about mushrooms, unless they found their way into her food. "Are you sure you're not a mushroom merchant pretending to be a prince?" she asked. The frog drew himself up, and bumped his head on the lip of the water bag. "I assure you I am the Prince of Tasnim, and as such, it is my business to know as much as I can about my city and how to help it prosper. The mushrooms have a terrible smell and must be kept away from where people sleep, or they complain. So the mushroom caverns are surrounded by storerooms." Anahita couldn't imagine her father knew as much about his own city as Philemon knew about Tasnim. What sort of prince tells his people where they can live or grow mushrooms? "I thought there were advisors and officials who took care of such things," Anahita said. "My father was more lenient about such things, letting people choose for themselves and move if they needed to. But the city is more populous now, or it was, so after numerous cases where I had to judge in favor of one or the other of the city's residents, I assigned an official to take care of things." He hesitated before continuing in a rush, "One of my concubines, if you must know." "A woman holding office in a city? How is this possible? Surely no man would accept the judgment of a woman, and a concubine at that." He made a sound of disgust. "Tasnim is not like other desert cities. Our women are not nothing. Tasnim was a garrison city and some of the garrison were women, some say the fabled Amazons from the east. They fought and died like men and were accorded the same citizenship when the city became a sovereign principality, no longer beholden to the fallen ancient empire, who had brought together soldiers from such distant parts. My own great-grandmother ruled as princess regent until her son came of age to claim the throne as his own. Rahat was one of the women given to me, who did not wish to remain in the harem. I believe she ran her father's household before she came to me, and after listening to several days' petitions, she informed me that I needed to do something about regulating my city. And she volunteered for the role. Any citizen of Tasnim who had a problem, man or woman, with her judgments, could still appeal to me, but I cannot recall a single time that I judged against Rahat. She was terrifying. I found out much later that the decision to hand her over to the city to pay for the hospitality of her father's caravan was hers, and that her father was most upset when he discovered it. Now he'd piqued her curiosity. Did she not have a husband? Actually she did. She was quite partial to a particular kind of pastry that one of my palace cooks specialized in, and she married him. I gave her a set of golden bracelets as a wedding gift. She wore them always, and the clinking sound of them terrified many, I am told. You allowed your concubine to marry your cook? The frog waved his hands emphatically. She was never truly a concubine, not in the way you mean the word. And she was a city official, a citizen, mistress of her own destiny. I could have challenged the marriage, but only if I'd wished to press my own suit and marry her instead. Rahat would have turned me down flat in any case. What of her father? The frog shrugged. He surrendered her to me, along with any right he had to decide her future. Unwillingly, as it later turned out, but by that time it was too late. Rahat made sure of that. He smiled. To the enduring benefit of Tasneem, I must admit. Who lived there? Aside from you and your concubines who weren't really concubines. And your cook? Merchants mostly. Men who used their share of Tasneem's wealth to go into trade, financing caravans who were entitled to the hospitality of the city at no charge, because they were owned by the city's merchants. Women who chose to marry men in the city, rather than leave the city and risk falling into the hands of a husband who would not be as civilized as the men of Tasneem. Others chose to go into business on their own. I believe the mushroom merchants were two sisters, come to think of it. I would like to visit Tasneem. It sounds nice. An impossible dream is what it sounded like. And yet, from Philemon's words, it sounded very real. She needed to see it with her own eyes to believe such a place could exist. Where women could choose. When you visit, you will stay there as my honored guest, the frog promised. Oh, she wanted to believe it so much. And what if I do not wish to leave? The frog spread his arms wide. Then you will need to find a way to earn your keep until you attain citizenship. Take up a trade perhaps, or marry one of the city's citizens. The men of Tasneem value a good cook over a pretty face, for beauty fades. He held up his hands in supplication. Not that you have anything to worry about. A plain woman such as yourself could never be considered just a pretty face. Plain? If even a frog called her plain, there was no hope for Anahita. Of course she knew her beauty did not compare to Maram or some of father's more favored wives, but that didn't make it hurt any less. She had nothing to offer Tasneem. A plain face and no skill at cooking. As for a trade, all she knew how to do was hunt. Is there a place in Tasneem for hunters who are good at hawking? Anahita asked. The mews in Tasneem has been empty for as long as I can remember. No falconer could keep the birds happy in an underground city, I understand. The job is yours if you wish it. For a moment, hope blossomed in her chest. A life with only her birds to care for, no husband, no harem, nothing but hunting. But her father would never allow it. But if he did not know, believed her happily married to some sheikh. Then and there, Anahita made a vow to herself. She would help the frog break the curse, even if she had to enlist Maram's help to find and persuade the enchantress to do so, and make Tasneem her home. She would finally be free. 22. You know what he's after, don't you? Asad asked in a low voice as he helped Anahita unsaddle the camels. Who? Haidar. Of course. He wants the impossible, to turn back time, Anahita said. To have his wife back. Not Haidar. The frog. The one who rides with you and fills your ears with tales of old, Asad said. Philemon wants to break the curse and go home to Tasneem. After listening to him for so many days in the desert, she knew that for a certainty, for all his tales were of Tasneem, the magical city where a woman could be more than property. He wants you to do it. Anahita stared. You're wrong. He's never asked for any such thing. He only wants me to take him to where he can find the enchantress who cursed him, so she removes the curse. Just because he hasn't asked you yet, doesn't mean he doesn't want it. It's well known that a kiss from a princess can break most curses. Anahita burst out laughing. In stories maybe. But I have never heard of such a thing happening in real life. Asad shrugged. Ask him then, for heavens no, you're the only one who understands the croaking sounds he makes. If anyone knows how to break his curse, it's the frog. He says he's a prince. Asad snorted. If you had to ask a pretty girl for a kiss, wouldn't you say you were a prince instead of some lowly camel herder? Yes, but what if he was a camel herder? Would that make a difference? He talked about Tasnim with the familiarity of someone who had lived there all his life. To hear Philemon say it though, even the lowliest citizen of Tasnim could still invite her to stay inside the city as a guest. And once inside, she could lay claim to her place as the prince's falconer. I'm sure I'm not important enough for a kiss from me to work. Besides, I don't think he even knows I am a princess, high or low. And I don't want you telling him either. It was Asad's turn to laugh. No man needs to be told. The uppity way you carry yourself and order everyone about tells the world what you are. Anahita dropped the saddle, sending up a cloud of dust that made her cough. It took a long moment for the coughing fit to subside before she said, "Oh yes, and I'm sure princesses regularly take care of the camels whenever they travel. If I were Maram, I'd stand by impatiently tapping my foot until my pavilion was ready for me, and retire in there where my servants tended to my every need." Haidar would do it if you asked him. He'd set up your tent and help you wash quite happily. He would too. But Anahita would not torture her friend so with what could never be. I'd sooner order you to start making a meal for us. And he didn't call me pretty. In fact, he regularly tells me how plain I am. Then your frog's a fool. But I'd be an even bigger fool if I let you cook. I'll tell you what. I'll wager the new knife I bought in the market before we left, the one with the emerald set into the handle, that he asks you for a kiss before we reach the sheikh's camp. Anahita eyed the water bag where Philemon traveled by day, but he'd hopped over to the shallow pool of fresh water where Haidar was filling up the water jars. If you're wrong, I get the knife. If you're right, I'll have a second such knife crafted to match the first as my gift to you when we get home. And they would go home, Anahita added silently to herself. Asad rubbed his hands. An easy bet, I'm sure. You know what else is a foregone conclusion? What you'll do when he asks you. Was she so transparent? Asad's assertion had taken her by such surprise that even Anahita wasn't sure what she'd do. What then? She asked finally. You'll feed the frog to your falcon, of course. Your father may not know it, but we do. You'll never let another man touch you again. And he might be a frog now, but whatever else he is, that one's a man. Asad jerked his chin up. Your bird's back. Looks like she has dinner too, so I'd better get the fire going. He headed off. Anahita watched Merlin glide gracefully to land at her feet, before the bird laid her catch out proudly. A scurrier of some sort, and a small one at that. Not enough to feed one, let alone 3 of them. Asad could cook something from their provisions tonight. You eat it. Maybe next oasis we'll have more ducks. Or frogs, the falcon said, neatly eviscerating her prey. At least the bird had forgotten about Philemon for the moment. Anahita wished she could do the same. Because despite Asad's assertion, she wasn't as sure she'd refuse him if Philemon asked her to help him break the curse. Usually the journey through the desert dragged, but with him to talk to and tell stories of the wonders of the city he loved so much, the week had flown by. She'd thought his overweening pride would have put her off, but somehow, she'd grown used to it. Maybe even liked him. So if he asked for her help, could she in conscience refuse? A kiss was such a small thing, really. 23. From his perch atop a camel's back, safely wedged into the neck of a water bag, Philemon watched the three of them set up camp, like he had every night since he joined their small caravan. Haidar refilled their water supply and Asad built a fire and began to cook. Anahita sent her bird off hunting while she pitched the tent and carried their bedrolls into it, so that they might sleep comfortably. If they hadn't stopped at an oasis, Haidar would help her with the tent. Anahita's eyes often followed the falcon's flight, while she wore a wistful expression, as if she wished she could fly with the diabolical bird. For the first time he wondered what her story was. He wished he'd spent less time talking and taken the time to ask her about herself. He knew she was an experienced desert traveler, and the way she and her brothers divided up the tasks in camp so easily, she must travel with them often. She might not know it, but she was freer than any desert woman he'd ever met, including those who lived in Tasnim, for the women of his city had mostly stayed within the underground city. For all their freedom, Tasnim citizens did not spend much time staring at the sky, or even standing beneath it. Every morning she lifted him from his bucket and into the water bag, never once flinching at his slimy skin. It wasn't that she didn't notice either. Her brothers had made comments on how they would not carry frogs as she did. She'd smiled, shrugged, and thrown a teasing comment right back at the brother in question, but she hadn't let him go. He'd found himself racking his brain to tell her tales he hadn't shared yet, half-remembered events from his childhood, or tales of the history of Tasnim, which she'd never heard. He'd even found himself telling her about his journey through the dark to the oasis, and discovering he'd been turned into a frog. So what if he'd made it sound like a glorious adventure, instead of the nightmarish reality? Her eyes had still grown wide before she'd laughed in all the right places. More than anything, he wanted to take her home to Tasnim, and show her all the wonders his words simply couldn't describe. But first he would have to find a way to break the curse, and return the waters to his city. Otherwise there would be nothing but empty caverns to show her, before her bird tried to eat him again. If only her brothers had brought her sooner, and tried to trade her for Tasnim's hospitality. Then he might have persuaded her to become one of his concubines. Though he suspected she would refuse the honor. If her brothers had been willing to part with her, which seemed equally unlikely. It was a foolish thought, he told himself. Better to focus on breaking this curse, and claiming his princess bride from the Sultan. Whatever beauty the Sultan bestowed on him would surely be enough to turn his thoughts away from a barbarian girl, chance met in the desert. A girl as unattainable as the rising moon. "Will you join us for dinner, Philemon?" Philemon roused himself from his gloomy thoughts to find Anahita standing before him, her cupped hands ready to carry him. He could not smell the stew already steaming over the fire behind her, but he didn't need to smell it to know it would taste far better than any meal he'd eaten since that enchantress pushed him down the well. But the fire had probably drawn an inordinate number of bugs by its light, and Anahita wished him to take care of them. "I'm not sure you'll like that," he said, stepping into her hands. "Watching a frog crunch through a bug while it's still alive is enough to put the strongest man off his food. I guess my stomach is stronger than that of most men. But then, I've watched my birds rip their prey apart for as long as I can remember." Philemon shuddered. "Where is the creature?" "Merlin is hunting. She says there are a large number of fat frogs in this oasis, and she intends to catch them all." Anahita ducked her head. "I thought you might prefer to stay with us, where she does not mistake you for food." Ah, so she didn't want her dinner interrupted by having to rescue him from the bird again. If Philemon could but carry a blade at his hip, he would soon see the bird off, but neither Anahita or her brothers had a knife small enough to serve him as a sword. "You are fortunate that I am a prince and not truly a frog, or I would take offense at the bird's slaughter of my family," Philemon said. "For honor's sake, I would be forced to kill the bird and all who harbor it." Anahita shook her head. "And that's why I know you're not truly a frog. Animals do not say such things, or care about honor. I still imagine it would be distressing to see the slaughter of your fellow creatures, especially with your human sensibilities. She set him on a rug beside the fire. He had barely a moment to notice that it was the rug she usually draped atop her bedroll, before his body seemed to sneeze again. He's too skinny to be a prince. Pampered princes are plumper than that, a male voice said. It took Philemon a moment to collect his scattered wits, before he realized the man meant to insult him. He leaped to his feet. Plump or skinny, a prince defends his honor. Give me a blade and I will make you regret every word. Someone threw a bundle of cloth at him. Put some clothes on so you don't put Anna off her dinner. Philemon caught it, and he was stunned to find his own hands holding the bundle instead of his four-fingered frog ones. By what miracle, he began. Anna's idea. Last time you turned into a man, it was in her bed. She figured it was worth a try. I bet it would work. Assad said it wouldn't. I'll share the wineskin I won off him with you if you can tell me why. Anna insists there's nothing magical about her bed, but she doesn't usually share it with animals. Philemon shook his head. I know not. I have never been cursed before. And if I can break this one, I hope never to be cursed again. Realization dawned. You can hear me. Understand me. Haidar nodded. Well enough to see Anna isn't telling tales about you being a man under some spell. He lowered his voice. Put the robe on and she'll come closer. Naked men frighten her. Philemon's gaze followed Haidar's pointing finger to where Anahita stood, at the very edge of the firelight. The reflected flames glittered in her eyes and off her teeth as she bit her lip. Contrary to her brother's words, there was no fear in her expression. She stalked forward, as graceful as any desert hunting cat. By the time she stepped between Philemon and the fire, he had eyes for nothing but her. The firelight turned her thin tunic transparent, highlighting the curves it otherwise might have hidden. Beautiful. Like an angel come to earth. He wanted to say the words aloud, but his mouth was too dry for any sound to come out. He lifted his gaze to meet her eyes but found them downcast. Not to the ground but to his groin. Because a prince's cock refused to bow down to a beautiful woman. Instead, it rose to greet her. Ready. For something her wary eyes said she would never agree to. Philemon sighed and slipped the robe over his head, hiding his arousal as he tried to think of anything but the beautiful girl before him. Beautiful. Untouchable. Unless he was a frog, when she took him in her hands and… Will the spell object if I sit beside you? Or will you turn back into a frog? Philemon's eyes sprang open to find Anahita sinking to her knees before him. No, beside him on the bedroll, close enough to touch if he took his place beside her. A place she patted, a playful expression on her face. I rarely bite, Philemon. Except when it's my dinner. She accepted a bowl from Assad. Sit down and hide that tent in your tunic, Assad muttered, shoving a second bowl at Philemon. Philemon did as he was told, telling himself that if he'd had a sister as irresistible as Anahita, he would be just as protective. But she sat close enough for him to feel the heat of her through his thin robe, while her brothers sat on the other side of the fire, their eyes fixed on Philemon. Torture. Temptation. Both terrible and yet. You should have left the stew to cook for longer. The meat is tougher than I like, Anahita said. Assad shrugged. Use your dagger to cut it into smaller pieces. Or don't eat it. It is all the same to me. Anahita's arm bumped his side. What do you think, Philemon? Do you agree that Assad did not cook the lamb enough? Philemon turned his attention to his food. He spooned up some of the stew and brought it to his lips. The sauce was well spiced and salted, but so was the meat. Spiced lamb as good as anything he'd tasted in Tasnim. He owned it was a little chewy, but no more so than any slice of roast lamb he'd eaten in the past. Right now, it might as well have been manna from heaven, it tasted so good. Before he'd realized it, he'd finished the bowl. "Is there more?" he asked. Too late did he realize that Anahita and her brothers might not have enough food to satisfy him, especially after so long eating like a frog. Assad scraped a spoon through the pot, eyeing Philemon across the fire. "Maybe," Assad said slowly. "What price would you pay me for it?" Anahita hushed him. "Philemon is our guest. It breaks the laws of hospitality to expect a guest to pay for a meal we invited him to. To hear you tell it, he claims to be the Prince of Tasnim. Do you know how much it costs for the privilege of a bowl of lamb stew in Tasnim?" Assad asked. A man who drove a hard bargain. Philemon could respect that. "I will trade one for the other. A meal at my table in Tasnim for a meal here at yours." He glanced around. "A meal for all of you, with as much of my best wine as you wish." Assad wiped his hands. "Take note, Anna. No man of Tasnim would pay such a price for a simple meal, let alone a prince. I don't know who your frogman is, but he is not who he claims to be. A meal in Tasnim costs a prince's ransom. If he'd tossed me a gold coin for stew that would cost him 2 coppers in the capital, I'd have believed him." He bowed mockingly in Philemon's direction. "Perhaps you will have more luck fooling the next caravan who offer to help you. I am going to go water the dunes, and I will be a while." He marched off into the darkness, muttering under his breath. Haidar rose from his seat and peered into the pot. "There is plenty left if you want it. No matter what he says, Assad is as hospitable as the rest of us. It's yours." He held out the spoon. Philemon rose and stepped forward to accept it. On his second step, the world constricted to crush him. 24. Anahita watched in stunned horror as Philemon's robe fluttered to the sand, seemingly empty but for a tiny bulge she knew had to be his frog body, especially when it moved. She rushed forward and scooped him up, robe and all, then dropped him back on her bedroll. She wasn't sure what magic let him become a man there, but she intended to find out. She might not be an enchantress, but she still was a witch, even if all she could do was understand animals. Though understanding Philemon was proving quite a challenge. She'd never met a frog like him, or a man like him either. The robe ballooned out as the magic in him turned him into a man again, or at least she hoped so. Philemon groaned. "I'm going to check on the camels," Haidar said pointedly. "Like Assad, I will be a while." Anahita didn't pay him more than a fleeting glance and a distracted nod, as she patted down the robe to find the man she hoped was inside. He felt normal. A sigh of relief whooshed out of her as his head emerged from the neck of the robe. "Thank heavens," she breathed. Philemon sat up suddenly, and his face was dangerously close to hers. It was now or never. Anahita took a deep breath, then pressed her lips to his. "Please let this kiss break the curse," she prayed to anyone who was listening. For a second they stayed there like that, before Philemon leaned back and broke the contact between them. "What was that?" he asked. Her heart sank. "A kiss, of course. Assad thinks that a kiss from me might break your curse, and as we arrive at our destination tomorrow, you might appreciate being able to walk around and talk to people as a man again, as I will not be as available." "Yes, I have heard that women can be quite busy at weddings. Especially if they are close to the bride," Philemon said dryly. Anahita wet her lips. Dare she tell him the truth? No, she could not risk it. "Yes, I am close to her. So if I can help you break the curse, it must be tonight." "You must kiss me tonight?" Curse him, it almost sounded like he was holding back laughter. "I already did," she snapped. He did laugh then, a rich sound that echoed off the dunes. Nothing like the reedy voice of a frog. It did things to her belly. That wasn't a kiss. Definitely not something a spell would recognize. Anahita pouted. What sort of kiss does a spell recognize? Tell me and I shall do it. I don't know for certain, never having broken a spell with one before, but I imagine a kiss with the power to break spells would need some passion behind it. You'd need both your heart and soul in it. And your tongue. My tongue? What was she supposed to do with her tongue? Lick him? Desperately, Anahita wished she'd brought Maram along. She knew about kissing and such things. For all her husbands, Anahita had never kissed a man in her life. This idea was rapidly turning into a terrible one. But if she could break the curse, she had to do it tonight. For tomorrow would be too late. Very well. His face loomed close, almost too close, and he lifted a hand to her cheek. Not to capture her, like other men might have. No, his fingers brushed against her hair as his palm cupped her jaw, sensing she needed the support or reassurance. Leaving her free to flee if she needed to. But she did not need to, Anahita scolded herself and her racing heart. Why, even her breath was coming fast now. His thumb traced her lips. The top one, then the bottom, as she forced herself to exhale slowly. Don't be afraid, he said softly. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't. By all that was holy. Then his lips touched hers, and she forgot all else. He inhaled, stealing her breath before sealing his mouth to hers. Her mouth opened almost of its own accord, her lips following his. And then his tongue stroked hers, a teasing invitation to come out to play. She wasn't afraid. She cupped his face in her hands and kissed him back with all of her being. Tongue, lips, breath, heart, maybe even her very soul. Clumsily at first, but when he didn't seem to care, she grew bolder, opening her eyes and raising them to meet his. And she was lost. Utterly and completely lost, yet found, never wanting to stop. Anna. Anna. Who was calling her name at such a moment? Breathe, Anna. Her face was pressed against a broad chest as a tender hand stroked her hair. She sucked in a breath, then another, relishing the taste of him on her lips, her tongue. The heat of him, so close. Philemon, why did you stop? She asked. Laughter rumbled beneath her cheek. What do you think your brothers would do if they knew you'd kissed a frog with such passion you'd forgotten to breathe? Her brothers? Anahita flicked her fingers. Nothing, I'm sure. They hardly know I exist, so I'm sure they would not care what happens to me. Not so. Haven't they been watching us all evening? I'm sure Asad and Haidar care very much about you. So much that if they knew what we had just done, they would happily bury me alive in a desert grave before dawn. It was her turn to laugh. Asad and Haidar aren't my brothers. They're my father's sworn men. Haidar's voice came out of the dark. Your sworn eunuchs? Philemon stiffened. Sworn to protect me, Anahita amended. Ready to come at my call, should I need their help. Philemon eased away from her. Men who would happily remove a frog from your bed. I should find my own bed or bucket. He rose. Anahita grabbed his arm. No. If any kiss can break a curse, that one should have done so. Surely. You should sleep here. I will take some of the spare cushions and things in the tent. Or take Asad's bedroll. He often complains it is too soft for him. She bit her lip, unable to tear her eyes away from his. Philemon looked so sad. Tell me that kiss was enough. He sighed. One kiss from you will never be enough, and yet, it must be. But yes, if any kiss had curse-breaking powers, it was yours. He pried her hand from his arm. I thank you for your hospitality tonight, and pray that your dreams are sweet. Her dreams were never sweet. Especially not the night before she married. Anahita turned away before Philemon could see her grimace. "Sweet dreams to you too, Philemon," she called over her shoulder with forced lightness as she trudged to the tent where she hoped she might get some sleep tonight. 25. Oh no! The feminine wail woke Philemon from what had been a sound sleep. He scrambled out of the covers and blinked in the blazing sun. He'd missed the dawn this time. Possibly because the blankets on Anahita's bed had blocked it out. "What is it?" he mumbled, wishing his mouth didn't taste like the inside of someone else's sweaty sandal. He'd drunk too much wine last night. The curse didn't break. Already on her knees, she stretched her hands out to Philemon, and he stepped onto them without thinking. "No," he agreed. He hadn't the heart to break it to her that the only kisses capable of breaking curses came from princesses, and this desert girl wasn't capable of fooling a curse into believing she was royalty when she wasn't. Besides, the witch had said something about a princess's bed being the key. Perhaps Anahita's bedroll had once belonged to some minor princess, before someone stole it for her. He was damn sure that he'd given Anahita her first kiss. He'd meant to make it quick and light, but the moment her natural passion had asserted itself, pushing aside her initial awkwardness, he hadn't been able to let her go. It had been like drowning, with her lips breathing life into him for the first time. And yet, they'd been so intent on each other, they'd forgotten to breathe. "You don't have time for that today. You need to get dressed so we can head out," Haidar said, holding out the water bag Philemon usually rode in. Philemon hopped into the cool water. Darkness engulfed him as someone stopped the bag, but he wasn't worried. He'd push the stopper out once he felt the sway of the camel beneath him, when they were underway. In the meantime he dreamed of Anahita's kisses, and how he might manage to keep her forever. The bag lurched to one side, then back, water sloshing around Philemon as the camel rose cumbrously to its feet. The ride began bumpily at first, until the camel settled into a steady pace. Finally, Philemon set his shoulder against the stopper, pushing until he felt it pop free. "So what does a frog have to promise a lady to be invited to her table again tonight?" he asked, peering up. Haidar shook his head. "I don't speak frog, so save your croaking. Her Highness has no time for pets today. Even her precious bird rides with Asad." Philemon leaned out further so that he might see the truth of Haidar's words. Before them rode Asad, with the bird on a perch strapped to his saddle. And behind them, Philemon swallowed. The white-veiled desert maiden was no more. Instead, she wore the colors of the desert, a bright reddish-orange stiff with gold embroidery that made her glitter in the sun. The rich robe draped over the saddle so extravagantly that the silk hid both her and the saddle completely. As the sun rose higher, the cloth canopy above her would shelter her from its heat, but now the only shadow it cast landed on her face, so he could not even see her eyes. She looked like some desert queen out of legend, ready to lead an army into immortality. No, to accept a defeated army's surrender. Dressed so, she was clearly no warrior. Her Highness, so she was a princess after all? Or was it all a pretense? A stolen bedroll, stolen clothes, was she a pretend princess or a very real one? He wanted to ask, but Haidar would not understand him. Philemon stared at the regal statue that had to be Anahita for a moment longer, before he retreated back into his water bag, pulling the stopper into place behind him. 26. Muffled shouting as the camels drew to a halt caught Philemon's attention first. The rough descent as his camel sank to its knees confirmed it. They'd arrived somewhere. Their destination, perhaps? A long moment passed, but no one unloaded his water bag, so he pushed at the stopper to peep at his surroundings. A desert nomad camp stretched out across the sand, brightly colored tents huddled together against the surrounding dunes. The men who had assembled to greet the small caravan wore clothing as patched as the tents. Despite its size, this was not a prosperous camp. A clinking sound drew everyone's attention away from the new arrivals. Could it be Rahat? The crowd parted to let a man through. A man who looked like he'd raided his mother's jewel chest and had no idea how ridiculous he looked, wearing his mother's treasures. Gold bangles covered his forearms and countless gold chains weighed down his thick neck, some of them dangling as low as his protruding belly. The silk robe he wore looked like he'd stolen it from some courtesan, for surely no one else would wear such a garish shade of purple. Except perhaps a fool in the Sultan's court. But no man knelt before a jester, like these were now. Whoever this fool was, no one dared mock him. Even Haidar and Asad, who stepped forward to press their foreheads to the dust at the man's feet. Most honored Sheikh Basit, we bring a gift from the Sultan. Your bride, Her Highness Princess Anahita. Anahita's camel was the only one still standing, so she towered above all of them, including Philemon swallowed back Billah, her incensed future husband. A good obedient bride does not sit higher than her husband. She must abase herself, the sheikh announced. Philemon smirked. Anahita wasn't the abasing kind. This would be interesting. Asad and Haidar rose and headed for Anahita. A command from Asad made the camel kneel so that Anahita could dismount, but the girl didn't move. Instead, Asad and Haidar each took one of her arms and lifted her off the beast, carried her several feet, then deposited her on the sand. Her robe puddled around her feet, spreading into a train that swept along the sand behind her as she crossed the distance between her and her hideous husband-to-be. To Philemon's astonishment, she dropped to her knees, then threw herself face down on the sand. The sheikh smiled. Then he lifted his slippered foot, and brought it down on her neck. Philemon gasped, but no one heard. He wanted to storm across the sand and shove the sheikh away from her, but as a frog, he couldn't do anything. So much for Haidar and Asad claiming to be her sworn men. They weren't anything of the kind. A man sworn to protect her would have killed the sheikh by now, yet he still stood there, ready to break her neck with one stomp of his foolish foot. They really were eunuchs. Was this why Anahita had tried so hard to break the curse last night? So that he could help her when no one else would? No wonder she despaired when she discovered her kisses hadn't worked. She knew the fate that awaited her. Poor girl. Philemon couldn't begin to imagine what thoughts were going through Anahita's mind at that moment. Of one thing he was certain, she must be terrified.